Ms. Rogers O'Reilly and ask her to call the roll.
Commissioner Thompson?
Here.
Commissioner Peugeot?
Here.
Commissioner Lodge?
Here.
Commissioner Campanella?
Here.
Commissioner Bartlett? Vice Chair Schwartz?
Here.
And Chair Jordan?
Here. And hopefully that'll be the most difficult thing you have to do this afternoon, okay? It's all downhill from now. Mr. Cato. Oh, no, I'm ahead of myself. I'm sorry. So first item, we'll go to preliminary matters and review of a couple sets of minutes and resolutions. And let's take those separately, please. So first one will be the draft minutes and the resolution of March 14th pertaining to 1210 Olive Street. Any corrections on either of those?
Move to approve.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
I will be abstaining. I wasn't here. Anybody else?
I will be abstaining.
Okay, thank you. And that was for both the,
Minutes and a resolution.
correct. Then the draft minutes of March 21st and the resolution associated with 1533 and 1537 Shoreline Drive.
Mr. Chair?
Mr. Bartlett.
Yes, I have comments on the minutes under the roll call. Chair Jordan was absent, not present.
Any other corrections?
And on the resolution, I actually wanted to ask a question of Commissioner Peugeot. She was the one who made the motion, and I remember her comments on that project. There was to add under the conditions of approval, add a utility relocation condition, because that was showing up on our plans, but I didn't see that in the minutes or the motion, so.
My recollection was that staff was explaining to us that that's done at the building permit stage and therefore wasn't required to be explicit in a condition.
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, good, okay, thank you.
That makes sense. Ms. Rodriguez? You good? Okay. Any other corrections or comments?
Mr. Chair,
Please.
on the Planning Commission minutes for March 21st, on the administrative agenda, it's page 3, item 2C, it says Commissioner Schwartz reported attending the groundbreaking for the Sanson Clinic on Foothill Center, and it also says that on the minutes for 314 on page 4 of that. Did you report on it both times?
No, I did not, just once. And Commissioner Thompson and I attended that together. Do you recall the date that we, that was after a site visit, so
Yeah, I don't recall.
I think you can go back and
maybe
correct
Ms.
that.
Brooke can look that up.
Mr. Chair, on the minutes of the March 14th meeting, it says that the groundbreaking was on March 12th.
Okay.
So it's
So it
probably
only
reported
pertained to
on
the minutes of the 14th.
We'll remove those off the 21st.
Remove D2C.
Okay. Any others? Entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And I'll be abstaining. I was absent then. Mr. Cato, any requests for continuances, withdrawals, postponements, or addition of ex-agenda items? Oh, Ms. Brooks, sorry.
Mr. Chair, no, we do not have any of
Okay,
those.
thank you. Announcements or appeals?
Nope.
Okay. And do we have any speaker slips for items that are not on the agenda today?
No, I do not believe so.
Okay. I'd encourage you, if you are here to speak on either one of the two items today, now would be a good time to complete a speaker slip. They're in the back of the room, and if you just walk those up to any member of staff, they will work their way up here. So we'll move on to our first item, which is a application of Doug Fell, the agent for 35 State Street Hotel Partners, LLC. It's a substantial conformance request review with comments from the Planning Commission to the city administrator. And Ms. Brooke, if you would introduce the item and the
Mr.
staff.
Chair?
Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Bartlett.
I need to announce that I will recuse myself from this item, as this project is the work product of my architectural firm, but I will return to the dais for our next item on the urban forestry master plan.
Okay, we'll miss you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allison DeBusk, the project planner, will be providing the staff report today.
Okay.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Planning Commission. As you said, this is a substantial conformance determination discussion for the Entrada project. My presentation today will start with a brief overview of the SCD process in general, followed by a description of the Entrada project and its approval history, and then the currently proposed changes. So first, I'd like to explain what an SCD is. SCD stands for Substantial Conformance Determination. The process for reviewing SCDs is outlined in the Planning Commission guidelines, and it's a process for staff to review changes to a project that occur after it has been approved by the Planning Commission. There are 4 levels of review for SCDs. Level 1 is the most minor type of change, and level 3 is for more significant changes that staff believes warrant discussion and formal comments from the Planning Commission. The basic question to ask when reviewing an SCD request is whether or not the revised project is substantially consistent with the original approval. The SCD process for the current Entrada SCD request has included concept review by the Historic Landmarks Commission and review by City Land Development Team staff. Today we're here to receive comments from the Planning Commission, and next week the project will return to the HLC for additional design review comments. Finally, the City Administrator will make a determination as to whether or not the proposed changes are in substantial conformance with the originally approved project. To give you some background on the Entrada project itself, we'll start with an overview of the project location. The project includes development of 3 parcels referred to as areas A, B, and C, and they're located at the intersection of State Street and Mason Street, which is in the waterfront area of the city. Area A at 35 State Street was previously developed with the Californian Hotel, and that hotel has been partially demolished by the applicant for safety reasons. Area B at 36 State Street contains a building that is currently occupied by Hotspots. And Area C at 118 State Street is currently vacant and surrounded by a green fence, as you can see in this picture. And the site has been excavated for the underground parking that was approved and issued a building permit as part of the Entrada project. So the Entrada project was approved in 2001, and that approval included development of the 3 areas that I just identified, as well as right-of-way improvements. It included 56 timeshare units, and each one had a lockout, resulting in a total of 112 units. There was 17,500 square feet of commercial space, 2,500 square feet for a visitor information center, and 210 parking spaces. Here's a site plan of the approved development. And as you can see, the buildings were approved at or close to the front property lines, which required approval of front setback modifications at the time. There is also a paseo that runs through Area B, and there was plaza and paseo space on Area C. The Entrada project has a lengthy history. In 2001, the city prepared an EIR focused on view impacts and visual resources, and it concluded that impacts would be less than significant. Then the project was approved by the Planning Commission in July 2001. That approval was appealed to the City Council, and the City Council approved the project in August of 2001. The project was then appealed to the California Coastal Commission, who found no substantial issue with the appeal. In 2005, the city approved permits or issued permits for the public improvements and construction of the underground parking area on Area C. Final maps were recorded in 2006. This project has received several substantial conformance determinations since it was originally approved in 2001. The first was for the Ritz-Carlton Club in 2004, and the most recent was in 2010, and that was for some more significant changes to the site plan and project components. That SCD was approved in March 2010 by the city administrator, and it received design approval in 2010. And now moving on to the current SCD request. This chart compares the original project approval to the current proposal. There is no change to the project areas proposed for development, and also no change to the approved right-of-way improvements, which are currently underway. The project is now for all hotel units and no timeshare units. But as you can see, the amount of square footage associated with those rooms has decreased significantly because the proposed hotel rooms are smaller than the timeshare units were. There is additional commercial square footage proposed, and the Visitor Information Center is slightly smaller than originally approved. There is more parking provided. However, it should be noted that there's also more parking required due to the increased number of hotel rooms and increased amount of commercial square footage. So those were the statistical changes, and how that translates onto the ground is that all of the hotel units have been consolidated onto areas A and B. All of the parking has been consolidated onto area C, and that means that there's no longer underground parking on area B. There have been changes to the site plans for each area, including changes to encroachments into those required setbacks for which modifications were originally granted. There is less square footage overall on each area. There have been more substantive changes to the layout and massing of Area C, and there is now a ground level interior courtyard proposed on Area A. This chart shows project statistics for the approved project, the prior SCDs, and the current SCD request. As you can see, there's been a significant decrease in square footage on Area C, and overall there's been a decrease in the hotel and related square footage. There's been an increase in commercial square footage and also an increase in parking. When the Entrada project was originally reviewed and approved, there were several key issues, and some of these remain issue areas for review of this substantial conformance determination. The first is land use, and from a zoning perspective, the change from timeshares to hotel units is not an issue because they're considered the same land use in our zoning ordinance. The second issue relates to the setback encroachments and the modifications that were received for those. As I mentioned, the project received front setback modifications on each area, and the current proposal would change those setback encroachments. The applicant has prepared a table to compare the amount of encroachment from the original project as compared to both the March 2010 SCD and the current project request. Overall, there's a decrease of approximately 1,700 square feet of floor area within the setback area. However, the remaining square footage that does encroach has been moved around. So, for example, the amount of first floor encroachment has increased by 15% overall, which equates to approximately 1,600 square feet. The encroachment on Area B has also increased on all 3 floors. The reason for the net decrease in encroachment is the significant reduction of third floor area on Area C. A final consideration is environmental review. Staff finds that the issue areas that are potentially the most affected by the proposed changes are traffic and visual resources. Excuse me. With regard to traffic, updated traffic generation numbers were prepared, and they show that the current version of the project would not result in more traffic than the originally approved project. The primary reason for that is because hotel units generate less traffic than timeshare units. In terms of visual resources, staff reviewed the important view sheds that were identified in the EIR for the project and compared the current version of the project to that originally approved project. The changes would have negligible impacts on the majority of these views. The most affected view that was deemed important would be view 7, and that's a view through Area B. The proposed changes would slightly improve this view because the Paseo is slightly wider than it was with the originally approved project. And I do want to note that this view simulation was the one prepared for the March 2010 SCD, and we did not require an updated view simulation because the project is very similar to that version in terms of impacts on this view. Views 8 and 9 would be those views that are most affected by the proposed changes, although they were not identified as important views in the EIR. Staff finds that these views would be improved as compared to the originally approved project. So to conclude, the purpose of today's discussion is to receive comments from the Planning Commission and the public on whether or not the proposed changes are in substantial conformance with the original project approval. I do want to note that the applicant is not proposing changes to the approved street improvement plans. The wider sidewalk and reduced number of vehicle travel lanes was a major point of discussion throughout the project's approval history. However, since they are not proposed to be changed, they should not be the focus of today's SCD discussion. And finally, to reiterate, the Planning Commission will not be making any decisions today, but comments will be forwarded to the City Administrator for consideration before he makes a determination on the SCD request. And that concludes my presentation. I can answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Does anybody have any quick questions before we go to the applicant? No? Okay. Then we'd invite the applicant up.
Good afternoon, honorable commissioners. My name is Michael Rosenfeld. I represent 35 State Street Hotel Partners, the owner of the La Entrada project, and I'm pleased to be speaking before you today in finally bringing this project forward after such a storied history with this property. I'm going to limit my comments to an overview of our goals and initiatives with the project, and I'm going to allow our team to review the technical aspects. But I'd like to say that, first of all, we have a very strong commitment to finally moving this project forward and seeing the fulfillment of the vision for Lower State Street that was conceptualized a number of years ago. And in our outreach with the community, and with pretty much without exception, we have had resounding comments that really come down to, is this finally going to happen? Are we going to see this this project fulfilled? And the answer to that is yes. As a gesture of our goodwill in the process, we've completed the seismic improvements necessary for the original Californian Hotel, which was a human health hazard at the time we got involved with the property. And in working with city staff, we have completed a seismic retrofit and addressed those issues for public safety purposes, as well as cleaning up the Lower State Street area to try and make it a more pleasant setting until we're able to bring this exciting project forward. In addition to that, we have commenced the street improvement program, which was a condition of the project approval, and we've done all of this without having the full realization of the implementation of the project as we're proposing before you today. The changes, which are really refinements to the project, are intended to do two basic things. One, they are to conform to the original approval and many of the comments that were enunciated at that point in time to provide a retail presence on State Street to activate Lower State Street area to really create a public interface and to draw pedestrian interaction in that area and to fulfill the vision of the planning of that Lower State Street area. Including in that, we have made refinements to enhance view sheds, to reduce and eliminate additional underground parking, which would require excavation and dewatering. We have reduced overall setback encroachments, and we have emphasized the aesthetic aspects of the project to reinforce the architectural ideals that were originally conceptualized for that area. We believe that the project, as we present it before you today, is fully consistent with the original approval, and in fact, more consistent than some of the interim iterations that you've seen in addressing the goals that were originally enunciated in the project approvals. I can tell you unequivocally that it is our intention to move forward decisively and expeditiously, and with the indulgence of this commission and the city, we would like to commence the additional improvements on this project at the earliest possible date. One other minor request that we have in the SCD is to develop the project in a single phase. The project was originally conceptualized as a timeshare project, which, as stated by staff, and I'd like to thank city staff for their diligent efforts, and we appreciate their recommendation for consistency as well. The original project was a multi-phase project because timeshare units are sold anywhere from 8, 10, 12, or up to 52 weeks of individual increments to buyers. And so the original project that had 56 units or 112 timeshare units, you would have to times that somewhere between 12 and 52 multiples to get the total number of units, but about 1,000 plus actual increments of being sold to individual buyers. Consequently, the concept was that they would build that project in pieces because it would be too much to absorb at any one point in time, which in this case would not only prolong the development process, but it would create disruption to the area over a much more extended period of time. We have eliminated the timeshare component from the project entirely. This is now exclusively a boutique hotel that is meant to serve the area and to support some of the exciting changes that have occurred in the Funk Zone and in Lower State Street. In order to do that, we really need to build the project in a single phase. It would be inconceivable that you would deliver a hotel with the lobby in one phase and hotel rooms in another, and then the pool at some other future date. And so we have tried to bring this all together, which we think is a material enhancement and reduces impacts to the city. I'm very pleased and privileged to have the opportunity to develop this project in this great city, and we're very excited about the vision that we bring forward. I welcome any questions or comments that you have. And I'd just also like to say that I had the opportunity to do extensive outreach with the community. We did hold a community meeting at the Veterans Building last month, and it was really great. The neighbors are fantastic. The merchants in the area are wonderful, and everybody seems to be supportive of seeing this application move forward, and was really nice. We were able to incorporate into our design the comments both of the HLC and the community as we bring it to you today. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak before you today.
I'll walk you through some of these changes to give you an overview. My name is Melissa Sinarli. I'm with DesignArc. Mark Shields will also be presenting shortly after me. In concept, the revisions consist of the reorganization of the program, looking at project efficiencies from an operations standpoint and further design improvements. We were able to maintain the overall program description as the last approval, 123 keys. We've eliminated the timeshare as stated before, and try to maintain and enhance any of the project benefits that was presented last time. In doing so, the hotel is now consolidated on areas A, the old California building, and on area B, along with the most of the hotel amenities, with the exception of a few meeting rooms on area C. We've also consolidated the parking substantially, most of which are located in area C garage. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And a few remaining parking on both area A and B to alleviate some of the hotel valet considerations. Here's a project site aerial, which you're familiar with. Again, on the California Hotel, no major changes, mostly interior programmatic revisions. We were, however, able to go ahead and set back this piece of commercial. We had gotten some input from our neighbors at the Harborview Inn that they would prefer that setback to match theirs. We're now about 3 feet further back. It shrunk some of the room sizes above, but it was easy to do. Again, by consolidating the parking and diminishing the parking on this site, we were able to depress the courtyard at true grade and locate some more amenities like the spa and some back-of-house needs. Here's a brief overview of the main street elevations. State Street, there's our historic facade that we will maintain in the new addition. No changes proposed in the elevations, except for Mason Street. We did slightly shift the garage driveway entrance, approximately 17 feet or so, most of which was driven by having to locate some transformers inside the building. Moving on to Area B. As mentioned before, the garage below grade was eliminated from the basement level. The entrance happened off of Mason Street. We still have a few spaces remaining, I believe 4 total. We were able to set back farther from Helena, anywhere between 7 to 15 feet, depending on which side of the building you're on. And that happens on all 3 levels. As we've consolidated the hotel rooms and the shift that happened, we were able to still maintain the 123 keys, but expand the Paseo further by another foot. So based on Allison's comparison of the view study through Area B, that view shed should be even further improved. Here are some of the overview elevations, the main State and Mason Street elevation. Again, no changes proposed. One diminished item was that there used to be a ventilation tower for the garage in the basement level, so that went away. And on Mason Street, we just kind of changed a little bit the geometry of the arches to announce where the lobby is located. Moving on to Area C, some of the site plan changes there. As part of the program revisions, while we were able to maintain all 123 keys between areas A and B, there are no hotel rooms proposed on Area C. There is 8,900 square feet of commercial along State Street. That was probably one of our primary tasks, to engage and connect better with the State Street pedestrian flow and pull the retail further closer to State Street, sorry. The Visitor Information Center still remains in its location as previously approved, and we've also located some commercial on the corner of Helena and Mason to activate the transition into the Funk Zone. We've got some more hotel amenities with the meeting rooms properly aligned in axial with the lobby. And since HLC last saw it in January, we went back and made some more revisions to improve the setback and open the accessibility to the plaza. I'll let Mark talk to that a little bit more, but as you can see, there's, unlike the prior iteration, more lineal footage and opening onto 2 streets, whereas previously it was only open on State Street and encumbered by 2- and 3-story massing, whereas today what we're presenting to you is a 1-story level here for the commercial, 1-story, although a little bit taller, in the meeting rooms, and a small component of a 3-story building here. Here's an overview of the program comparison on all three sites. All three iterations of the entitlements. To your left is the original entitlement. In the middle is the previously approved project. And to the right is your currently proposed project. This is the basement level. As you can see, the original project had some hotel or timeshare program area here, and then mostly garage. Our last approved project had a further expanded garage, and our proposed is trying to utilize the existing hall, which was also one of our primary efforts to maximize capacity with the existing conditions. First floor, the original entitlement had retail along State Street, the Visitor Information Center on the corner, again, some garage in the back, timeshare units, a small plaza, although no landscaped area proposed, and some more amenities. The previously approved project had a different design and different concept. Again, the Visitor Information Center on the corner, commercial further back pulled away from State Street, and some private hotel amenities with a little bit of commercial on the corner. Today, what we're proposing is probably closer to the original entitlement with our commercial and retail fronting State Street. Some hotel amenity here with meeting spaces and facilities and pre-function space. And in our effort to draw more both public and activity and better transition to the flunk zone, we thought it was adequate and a necessity to put some commercial back there as well. As you go up the different levels, you'll notice that there's a significant change and diminished program area in our proposed today. We're looking at providing a parking deck, a multi-level parking deck on the first, second, and third floors. So the only piece of program areas remaining are these restrooms and that smaller commercial. With that said, I will turn it over to Mark Shields.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Mark Shields. I'm an architect working with DesignArc, and our team has put together a series of elevations for your review today. And I would like to start by pointing out that our new revised project is quite a bit lower, both in height and in massing, than the previously approved projects. And just to make that clear, I wanted to point out that these lines were the previously approved project heights. And you can see that our project, as proposed now, is quite a bit lower, pretty much in all areas of the overall height of the project. I'd also like to point out that not only did the heights change, but the massing has actually changed, so that portions of the building are much further back from State and Mason. And for instance, our corner commercial building here is about 120 feet from the edge of Mason Street, which opens up this huge corner park area. Some of the elements that we kept were the commercial massing, which is taller up against the Beacons building. This is the Mason Street elevation, and again, I'd like to point out the height differential compared to the old project that was approved, and our new project is quite a bit lower, even one story, on State and Mason. But I also want to point out that this portion of our massing is back substantially from Mason, which is a huge difference from before, where we had a portion of our project, the commercial edge, which was more proud and closer to State Street. Again, our massing on the corner is tallest up against the Beacons building, which is quite a tall building to begin with. This is our proposed State Street elevation, going up State Street this way, down State Street this way. This is the Visitor Information Center, and then flanked by our proposed commercial shops or stores along State Street. These are primarily, we'd like to think of them as extending the excitement and architectural language of State Street from Upper State Street down towards the ocean. Our corner park has opened up quite a bit from before. It's sunnier, and we've proposed a small palm grove on the corner as well as a nice public fountain. Beyond, you can see, and this is quite a bit beyond, I think this is 160 feet back, although it's always hard to see that in elevation. You have to understand that this massing is 160 feet back from the edge of State Street, and again, the taller portion is up against the Beacons building. Let's see. I'd also like to say that a little bit of information about our proposed park. And we envision it as a small park that's always, of course, enticing to the public to meander and walk through. Our corner is a nice shaded palm grove with a linear Moorish fountain that's up about 18 inches so people can sit on it and just sort of rest, hang out, watch the action on State Street. We're proposing a restaurant on the corner which also activates this plaza. And up a few steps, there's a lawn area which is just adjacent to the pre-function area for the hotel. And I like to compare this. I think there's been some misunderstanding, or people are trying hard to understand how this park works, but I like to compare it to the Mission Lawn, for instance. Even though our proposed park is quite a bit smaller, the Mission Lawn has, in a way, two levels. It has the Rose Garden, which has seating and people, quieter spaces. It has the upper level, which is more open and a larger lawn for people to play on, throw the Frisbee and whatnot. In a way, this park is the same. We have the larger open space up above, which is up about 30 inches, and the lower space, which is shaded with our fountain, which is at street level and on the corner. Because we pushed the massing back off the corner, this is looking across towards the hotel lobby, the park is now not shaded by any buildings on the south side. So the park is open to the corner, user-friendly, sunny, and we think it's a very romantic and enticing place for people to visit, stay, walk through, or whatever. This is another view looking back towards the interior of the park, and to me it feels a lot like the romance of maybe De La Guerra Plaza or maybe a corner of the interior of the courthouse gardens. So that's our emphasis and our hope that the building and project will have that Santa Barbara romance that people come to Santa Barbara to enjoy and to participate in. These are just some of our inspirational photos that we've gathered, and we'd like to say that our street frontage here with our jacaranda trees is not unlike the La Arcada building up on Figueroa and State with their alley of jacaranda trees. Our lawn area is reminiscent of the little courthouse, although ours is a bit smaller than the courthouse lawn, but hopefully will be as interesting. We envision kind of melding the landscaping with our small steps that go up 30 inches. We're using a variety of exotic, romantic Mediterranean plantings that Phil Suitings graciously helped us organize. And we're excited about the Phoenix Canariensis palm grove on the corner, which also relates to the other palms that we've situated across the street on State Street. So as you come up State Street, in a sense, when you intersect Mason and State, there'll be a sense of place that you've arrived somewhere, which is essentially an entrance to Santa Barbara and the bottom of State Street. And with that, I'd like to summarize some of the project benefits. I don't know if we need to read them all, but the public benefits are huge. All hotel versus timeshare, and fractional, a public plaza, above-grade parking with easy public access, better site access, connection to the vehicular and pedestrian traffic, reduced setbacks, encroachments, more hotel amenities. The fiscal benefits, increased bed tax, increased commercial retail sales tax, the improved architecture and views, significant building mass reductions on Area C, increased mountain views on Area C, which I forgot to mention. Actually, our one-story along State Street helps to open up the mountain views considerably from the corner of State and Mason, which is our Area A hotel site. increased view corridor in Area B. We were able to widen that and actually bring that interior plaza closer to grade level off State Street, so it's easier to access for the public. We have smaller average room sizes overall, so that helped us reduce the overall massing of the project, which I also think is significant, along with the reduction in height that we were able to accommodate. Let's see, reduced total program areas by 8,000 square feet. We've increased the on-grade landscaping significantly, and we have a single construction phasing, which will happen faster, both on and off the site, and the commitments are over $5 million spent to date, renovating and substantially preparing the old Hotel the Californian for remodeling. So with that, I'd like to conclude our presentation and leave you with this vision of our proposed project. We're excited about it. We feel that the hotel will be beautiful. We've tried hard as architects and the team to put together a project that feels like Santa Barbara, that has a romance to Santa Barbara, that will attract visitors to Santa Barbara, and that all of us Santa Barbarans can enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So if you guys can keep track of your questions, I'd like to do public comment first in case that also spurs some more questions. And while we're getting ready for that, I'd just like to remind the public and my peers that we're kind of all in the same situation. This is a discretionary approval process, but we aren't making the discretionary approval. We are going to give recommendations just like we're going to hear your recommendations. And when we get to that point where we have discussion, I think we want to stay on track on whether we feel that it conforms and why, or we think that it doesn't conform, but what would help it conform. And I think both the applicant and staff have made efforts to also highlight positive changes, but I think we should keep our suggestions for changes not related to the conformance issue as a separate comment, so that you're clearly deciding whether it conforms or not, or how you would get to that conformance. And then if you have any suggestions to the city administrator or even eventually to the HLC review process, that you clearly separate those out as input to that process. So I would be ready for those green slips. There's not too many, so I'm kind of just going to keep an eye on my clock up here for a couple minutes. So if you'd just please respect that we'd like to give you a couple minutes at a time, that would be great. The first speaker will be Lynette Hall, and she will be followed by Aaron Lynch.
Good afternoon. I have been fortunate enough to have lived here in Santa Barbara for the past 20 years. And after leaving a strip mall ravaged Los Angeles, I have been truly able to appreciate the beauty that exists here, a place that I now call home. So that said, I would very much like to endorse the Entrada project. This is one more example of what I think Santa Barbara does best: improve the city with great care and attention, protect the city against development that would compromise its integrity, and to continually make the people of Santa Barbara who visit pleased and proud. The regentrification of Lower State Street is exciting, and it's one more reason to support the project. The wharf is really the gateway to our city, where locals and visitors frequent our shops, dine on our cuisine, and set out to learn and love this jewel of the South Coast. I am excited and pleased for this project to move forward and enthusiastically support its progress and completion. Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron Lynch, and followed by Shelley Schulte.
Hello, my name is Erin Lynch. I am a 15-year city resident, and I wanted to add my voice of endorsement of this project. Coming from the hospitality and real estate industries from before, I've been following this for more than a decade, and I do believe it conforms to the approved plan. I think it says a lot that this community is so anticipating this project to get done. It's a community that applies a lot of scrutiny and assessment to development and redevelopment projects. And I think it says a lot that we're ready for it now. I think it's a missing piece that's going to connect all the other thriving areas, energetic areas on the waterfront, the pier, the energized funk zone, and the area above the tracks and State Street. And I think it will create a cohesive field that interlocks all those uses. And I'm here to endorse the project. So thanks.
Thank you. Shelley Schulte, followed by Michael Erickson.
Hi, my name is Shelley Schulte. I'm a mother of 3, lived in Santa Barbara for over 20 years. I come from a very small town, smaller than Santa Barbara, Carmel. We have a very, very small development, but it's a beautiful town, and they've kept the beauty of the town, and I think this project is gorgeous. I think it can only enhance Santa Barbara and bring on, I think it's just a really good idea.
Thank you. Michael Erickson, followed by Jackie Waddell.
Good afternoon. I am a 10-year resident of Santa Barbara. I also happen to be in the hotel industry for the past 30 years, worked for Four Seasons hotels and many high-end luxury properties, and I would put this on par with any of those in terms of the beauty and the thought that's gone into the detail of it. It's easy as a local resident to avoid Lower State because of the way it's looked the past decade or so, except when you have visitors coming in from out of town and they all want to go to the wharf or go to the water, and consistently you get asked what's going on down here, and it'd be nice to tell them that finally we're capping Lower State and really tying it into the upper portion of State Street. So I support the project and want to move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie Waddell, followed by Robin Himovitz.
Hello, my name is Jackie Waddell. I am a almost 30-year resident of Santa Barbara, and I ditto everything you have heard thus far. The Entrada project, I think, would be an amazing asset to this community. It is a doorway to the rest of our living, our Upper State Street. When I have family coming in to visit, it's always a place you would not take your mama. So I endorse it very much, and I'm hoping that it goes through. Thank you.
Thank you. Robin Himovitz, followed by Barbara Shohak.
Hi, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I made a few little notes. My name is Robin Himovitz, and I've been a resident here in Santa Barbara since 1984. Prior to that, I was up in San Luis Obispo and Chicago. I'm also in the hospitality industry further up the coast, and I'm very sensitive to the face that we present to our visitors and our locals. I've experienced Santa Barbara not only as a local, but also as a visitor. And we as a family have spent quite a bit of time down by the water. And it's been a long time that we've looked at that space as undefined. We're very anxious as we enjoy it, and as well as we bring visitors to Santa Barbara, that we take pride in that area. And I feel, after today's presentation and following this, that it's time to move forward. I feel that Lower State Street has been kind of a precarious place. It's a gap between the beautiful natural resources that we have on the ocean front and all of the effort that has been put into our art walk and many restaurants and businesses that are trying to make it down there. I think it's important that we bridge the break in the chain that one experiences as they go by this undefined and incomplete area. I support the approval of the Entrada project, and I look forward to the enhancement of our community. I think it's wonderful. Thank you again.
Thank you. And Barbara, I'm sure I butchered your last name, so I'm going to let you set me straight. And
Barbara Shoak.
Yep, thank you. You'll be followed by Kenny Slott.
I loved what I saw here today, and I came here mainly because many, many years ago, I had my sister come visit from Switzerland. We moved here 16 years ago from Switzerland. So when we were walking down on the pier with my sister. She loved looking at the city. Everything was so beautiful. And then we walked up State Street, and we came to this empty lot, and she said, "What is going on here? This is prime location. Nothing is, what is it?" And I said, "Oh, it will only be a few years. It will be beautiful." She's coming back this summer, and she will still look at that same empty spot. And I know it's a process, but I'm a little impatient, and I would love to see La Entrada de Santa Barbara built. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kenny Slott, followed by Mark Romasanta.
Hi, thank you. I'm here to support the Entrada project. Been a resident since 1980, businessman. Not involved in this project, but I'd like to see it completed for a lot of reasons. One that have been mentioned, we've all seen the various chapters of this project, but I think we also have the opportunity, we have an owner now that has shown good faith, has invested money, and I believe will see this project to completion. So I urge you to support it, and it appears from all I've seen to be substantially complete. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark Romasanta, followed by Bonnie Donovan.
Good afternoon. I'm Mark Romasanta. We are the closest neighbor to this property and have been since 1982 when my parents bought the property. We are very excited to see it moving forward. We fully support it. I think he's done a great job modifying the plans over the last year to listen to people's concerns, so we fully support the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Bonnie Donovan, and the last speaker will be Ray Mahoob.
Hello, native Santa Barbara. I am here to confirm that he did meet with the neighbors, and we planned on 50 people. 86 people showed up, and I think you were there, Mike Jordan? Yes, ma'am. And the only complaints everybody has is narrowing of the streets, which we know he has nothing to do with, you have nothing to do with, and it has to go on. And we could have put a kid through school how long us neighbors have waited for this property to be developed. And if there's anything you guys could do to help us get this back, it would be appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you. Ray Mahoob. If I didn't do well on that last name, I'll let you straighten me out too. Thanks.
My name is Ray Mahoob. I was born and raised in Santa Barbara. I own real estate here locally, and I have no involvement in the project. I don't know the developer, but I'm here to support the project. I think it's in full compliance. It's a wonderful project. As it sits right now, it's an eyesore. And frankly, as a Santa Barbaran, I'm embarrassed when I have friends and family coming to visit because it's just abandoned. It's attracting a lot of transients. You know, it's just it's an eyesore. So I'm looking forward for you to expedite this and green light it so that the developer can go on and develop the property. Because I'm really looking forward to being on top of that rooftop hotel and enjoying those ocean views. Thank you.
Thank you. Last call. Nobody else? Okay, then we will bring it back to the commission, and if we could exhaust questions first among us, and then we'll go to comments or discussion. Ms. Peugeot, do you have your light on, or not?
I do now.
Okay, I'll let you go first.
Okay, I have a couple of questions for staff, perhaps the city attorney, I'm not sure, and also the applicant. Should I combine those?
You just run in the order you'd like to go.
Okay, starting with staff. I have a question on the degree to which the current project has received entitlements or is vested, so to speak. If you could just give me just a quick little overview of what they have vested to and what they have not, if it even gets split like that.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Peugeot,
That's a legal question, and so the answer isn't, my answer isn't to that either correct or incorrect. I can give you my legal opinion. Anytime you talk about vesting, you invariably get back to a case that's probably 25 or 30 years old, decided by the California Supreme Court, called Avco Investments versus, it was down in South Laguna, and it was right after the Coastal Act passed, and it was a phased project that ultimately, like I say, ended up in front of the California Supreme Court, which established the legal principle that a developer and applicant only receives vesting, generally, at the point in which they've obtained their building permit and they have incurred substantial expense towards construction. In the Avco case, as I say, it was a phased development, and it was interesting that although they had done a lot of work, they had permits and done a lot of site work on their first phase, the California Supreme Court said that development, which I think is now developed, was not vested in its later phases. So you can see, in a way, it's somewhat relevant to our situation. I would have to say that the project approved by the City Council in 2001, well, actually by the Coastal Commission and the City Council in 2001, and which received its building permit in 2005, and for which there have been substantial conformance determinations issued, is probably a vested project. I mean, they've done a lot of work. They got a building permit, so it fits pretty squarely within the Avco decision. And then finally, I would just say, and I've been asked this question before, the question is how relevant is that? Because the new owner, this owner, really has no desire to build that project. The project that might be vested, they don't necessarily want to build that project. The timeshare project, the project with parking on B and C. So it's, in a way, it seems to me that that question and the answer is neither here nor there because they don't want to build that project.
Okay, thank you. My next question for staff is just a little bit more information on the parameters of the substantial conformity determination project. I believe this was described as a Category 4 substantial conformity determination. Since that, I think, is the highest category we have at the city, I believe what that means is if we found, or if staff found that it exceeded the criteria for that level substantial conformity determination, then it would need to come back in for some sort of overall revision or bigger revision for those changes. How would that work?
Commissioner Peugeot, that is correct. Typically, a substantial conformance determination is made by the Community Development Director. In this case, he's conflicted out, which is why the City Administrator is making it. If staff has concerns that warrant Planning Commission feedback, that is when we raise it to a level 4. If, based on feedback from the Planning Commission and combined with staff concerns, it's determined that the project is not in substantial conformance, then the applicant does need to apply for an amended project if they want to pursue that same version of the project.
And I'm assuming an amended project would go through an entirely different kind of review process than this.
That is correct. It would go through a standard process, basically starting from scratch with new discretionary actions, conditions of approval, et cetera.
And back through Planning Commission. And
correct. Environmental review and Planning Commission.
My next question has to do with the timelines, and this sort of bridges between the questions I have for staff and the questions I have an applicant might want to weigh into. I realize that the request is to build this entirely in one phase with this request. And I've heard from the applicant that the intent is to start as soon as feasible or as soon as possible. I also believe I saw somewhere where there was an existing 2016 completion date out there somehow. I would like a little more information on how that works. So that's a 3-year time period. And what does as soon as possible mean? Do we have any more information on that? And is the work still feasible in 3 years? Is the applicant and confirming for us that that could actually be done, especially after all the comments we just heard from the public about hoping to get something finished in there.
Commissioner Peugeot, I can start answering, and then if the applicant wants to add anything onto it, we asked them for a schedule so that we could determine whether or not it was even feasible to finish the project by 2016, especially one that is not at the level of receiving building permits yet. So the schedule that they submitted to us requires that design review get completed within the next year, and it anticipates construction beginning at the very end of 2014 in order to be complete by the end of June 2016. So it is a very tight schedule, but it is all laid out to where staff believes that it could be adhered to if the applicant shows due diligence throughout. So.
Thank you, Commissioner Peugeot. We're involved in a number of projects, so we're quite experienced at this. And as we articulated to the city, provided that we're deemed substantially consistent, we are prepared to complete detailed engineered drawings. We've already started street improvements and completed the seismic work, as was stated earlier. We would be completing detailed engineered drawings for this project and commencing construction at the earliest possible date. We're quite comfortable that as long as this process is completed expeditiously, that we can comfortably stay within the timeframes under the current SCD, which is the outside date in 2016, and to deliver the project fully completed. And the fact that we are doing the project as a single-phase project will also enable us to do that, as opposed to the fragmented prior envisionment of the prior owners. This would all be developed in a single unit, which would, again, limit disruption. Our specific mandate in approaching the refinements that we put forth to you today were to conform to the project approval as was originally established, and to minimize impacts, enhance public access and recreational capacity, increase public parking, and improve view sheds, as well as accessibility to each of the parcels. And as I said before, we were pleased that staff in the report did indicate that they believe that the project was substantially consistent. That is the approach that we took. In fact, we think it's more substantially consistent than prior iterations of the project and serves the goals that were originally set out for this. Thank you.
That completes my questions. Thank you.
You're good? Okay. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some starter questions, and then I may have some additional questions later, but I'd like to actually start at the beginning, which is to ask Mr. Wiley to address us all here today to further clarify the scope of the input. On page 3 of the staff report, our feedback to you and the city administrator is input. So in the context of a substantial conformance determination, we've not had many in the last several years come to the commission. Could you please give us some further clarification, and then I may have a follow-on question regarding that, Mr. Wiley.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz, I think that's a very good question, and because I think that this concept that the city's had, as Allison mentioned, in the Planning Commission guidelines since 1997 of substantial conformance determination has actually evolved in recent years and become more of a important process for the city, the Planning Commission and the planning staff in recent years. One of the first things I think of was what happened with the Cottage Hospital project up at the old St. Francis site, the housing project, which, if you recall, had the same thing come up. They needed, at some point, a substantial conformance determination after they had received all of their approvals. And as that was going through the process, and I think it was at the Planning Commission where we explained this, and the City Council as well, because there was an appeal made in connection with that determination, that Santa Barbara for years and years has had a quite detailed, quite intensive design and land review process. But that's all, as I see it, in the Santa Barbara context. We're not a huge city. We're not really an urban context. But so we don't get that many big projects. And my point here is that when we do get a big project for Santa Barbara, like the Cottage Hospital project or like this project, it's not unusual for the applicant and the architects in particular to realize, oh, we got our approval, but there are things that just don't really make sense anymore, that don't work. In the case of the Cottage Hospital project, it was really the footprint and the locations of the buildings and the setbacks that were changing. But the number of units, the number of dwelling units weren't changing. The architectural style really wasn't changing. Location, the pad, the exact location wasn't changing at all. And so we tend to look at these questions now in substantial conformance as maybe an appropriate evolution of a land use approval, where the land use considerations, and I think Allison's report was really good in laying this out, are really not all that different from what they were, say, in June of 2001 when this project was first approved by the Planning Commission, or even versus the later iterations of the project. The land use considerations, the environmental considerations, for example, the CEQA considerations, they're not all that different. Yet the design can be quite different. But I think we are saying that, well, we'll leave the design issues, in this case, to the HLC, or in the case of the Cottage project, to the ABR. But we'll talk about the land use considerations, and have they changed enough that we have to insist that the applicant, well, this is a revised application. This is not just an iteration, an evolution of your original approval. So I believe it's accurate to say at this point that the staff's position on this, as Allison's report laid out, is not only is this just an appropriate evolution of the previous land use approvals, it's actually improved evolution. While there are big differences, and possibly, for example, the plaza at Area C is considerably different than it was before. The question is does that really change how we look at this project from a land use perspective? So I hope that answers your question.
That's very helpful, and for me, it's a helpful bridge to my more detailed question, and this is, I think, a good slide that we're looking at now. What is substantially consistent? Not only to define what does substantial mean, since it's a substantial conformance determination hearing, but also to clarify for the commissioners and perhaps the public as well what the point of comparison is, or the project of comparison. This came up at our site visit on Tuesday. This has been an iterative process since 2001. We have an original project, and some believe that this is closer to, in fact, perhaps Mr. Rosenfeld mentioned, the current version of their view of this project and design and feel is closer to the original from 2001, and yet it's received various substantial conformance determinations along the way, along its evolutionary journey. So it would be helpful to also hear from you, Mr. Wiley, if you're the right one to comment on this, and for us to be clear what we are comparing the current project to in providing input.
Commissioner Schwartz, I think that the easy answer is really you're comparing it to the most recent substantial conformance determination, which
that from 2010?
Well,
or the 2009 commission?
I've been in this.
I believe saw it. Is that right?
It's all blending together. I really think the most.
2009 perhaps was the.
Yeah, I think it was 2009.
Okay.
And I have to add, the irony of something just prompts me to mention this, because I have been involved in this project for quite some time, and there was litigation over its original approval in 2001. Litigation, among others, filed by CPA and I believe another, maybe it was Urban Creeks, and they were represented by EDC. And I have to say, at least the CPA, EDC litigation, it was in a way friendly. It was like, well, they were clear that they didn't oppose any project. This is back in 2000, 2001, even prior to 1999. They didn't, but they were trying to get some of the size, bulk, and scales issues addressed in ways that they preferred. And so the irony of it is that I remember at one point they came up with a site plan that is very similar to this one that said, you know, we'll drop the litigation if you'll just do one story on Area C. And I don't know, the irony of that just I thought was relevant. So anyway, to answer your question, I really think at this point we're dealing with the most recent substantial conformance determination prior to this one. We did do one minor one having to do with moving the 10 parking spaces across the street from the railroad depot site. I don't see that as being particularly
Or
relevant
minor.
or anything like that.
So then would you agree, so now I'm going to get into some detail here. Would you then agree, Mr. Wiley, with Mr. Fell's letter to Mr. Armstrong? And there's a chart on page 3 in the SCD description, sort of a snapshot, original entitlement, previous approved SCD, proposed SCD. And so to the answer that you just provided, are we looking today to provide input in substantial conformance with the kind of the middle section, previous approved SCD?
That's correct.
Okay. Okay, very good. I'm going to now to thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to the topic of parking. And I'm trying to reconcile, and I'll think for a moment maybe who could best respond to this. In the staff report on page 3, there's a discussion of parking spaces. It's kind of in the middle of the page, 210 parking spaces. And I'm looking to reconcile the staff information in our package to Mr. Fell's letter in the number of parking spaces that have been reviewed and approved over time, because what I see here for Mr. Fell's letter, Mr. Fell, feel free to come up if you're the one to comment, but I'm not trying to put you in the hot seat. So Mr. Fell is identifying the original entitlement of 220, and then the previous approved, and Mr. Wiley, I think you're saying that's the project against which we should be considering substantial conformance, and that was 243 parking spaces. And currently, we have a proposed 264. Well, that's in Mr. Fell's letter, yeah, 264. So are we looking at the 264 to 243, and now all 264 are in Area C? I'm sorry, the majority, well, for the most part, the substantial number of parking spaces are in Area C. Is that that's correct? Okay, so are the numbers in Mr. Fell's letter, is staff comfortable that those are the ones we should be considering today?
Commissioner Schwartz, the reason for the discrepancy between Mr. Fell's letter and the statistics listed by staff is that there were 10 additional spaces provided off-site for the Visitor Information Center. So that's the difference between the 210 and the 220 that are listed.
Okay, and then briefly to staff, and I don't know if I see Mr. Dayton here or Mr. Bailey, I'm not sure who might want to comment on this. Are you comfortable then, and if you want to comment at all, about staff's belief that the 264 spaces used by hotel guests and the public parking now on C is going to be minimally adequate, overparked, however you'd like to describe it? Maybe you could just give me your thoughts on where we are today vis-a-vis the 243, which is the project against which we're looking at conformance. And kind of how, maybe, and I'm sorry, as you're coming up, maybe you could further comment how we got from 243 to 264 and why do we need the additional parking there? Kind of what prompted that requirement?
I think one thing that you
Mr.
have
Fell.
to, when you're looking at the totality, and in the letter I was speaking in totality, but really what we've got is hotel parking and then public parking. And we have always been under the impression, and I think a correct one, that if we could maximize public parking, it was a community benefit. Because we are under the terms and conditions of the original approval and each iteration, was that we would operate the public parking exactly like it's operated throughout the community by the city. So first 75 or 90 minutes for free, same rates, same everything. And there was, I remember a comment in the early approval process that there just isn't enough parking in the beach area. So if you can maximize it, that's great. So we have tried at every stage to maximize the parking.
So, I'm sorry, Mr. Feld, just for my own education. So is the delta between 264 and 243 the public parking?
It was in the public.
Okay, excellent. I just needed that. Thank you so much. Then I'd like to go to the site plan and look at Helena Avenue, and perhaps Mr. Dayton can help me here in this discussion. At the site visit on Tuesday, the issue was raised that there would likely be further hardscape changes and also landscaping, but we won't talk landscaping today. Hardscape changes, both with the curb extensions and perhaps other areas here for traffic circulation, unloading, loading, the parking of both hotel cars, maybe also the public parking. And in that is not in our packet, and I am somewhat concerned about that, but I'd like to have the discussion today about and have staff respond to at least what discussions are underway regarding changes from what we see on this site plan and for what purposes and any relevance that has vis-a-vis substantial conformance. And that's both, turning from East Mason, both turning left and then right, kind of on both sides of Helena.
Hi, I'm Stacy Wilson. I'm with Transportation Planning, and we've been working with the applicant prior to this meeting, and what the paving changes on Helena, in particular, I think we'd see the greatest change on Area B. Currently, there is kind of the paving goes out into the parking lane, and what would change would be that we would probably get that paving to come and, be the curb to be in the same alignment and use that area for loading for Area B.
Maybe could we point to that area of the slide so we all know what portion we're referring
Thank you.
to? Okay.
You can see how it bumps out a little bit there on the top. And that would change and become straight, just
So
a
was that a
continuation.
full curb extension at the time this was designed, right there? And then the curb comes in and then it pops out again? Am I seeing this correctly on the site plan there? See how it, there's a curb extension, then it comes back in closer to the building and then comes out again, as far as I can tell.
I have a little hesitation, and I'd defer to the applicant, because what I can say from a staff perspective is that we looked at it and we didn't think that was the appropriate, and so we've asked for something. We've asked for the different configuration where the curb line is continuous and to use that area for loading.
And so what is your opinion about the relative impact to traffic circulation in having these discussions? Minor, anywhere from significant to minor, let's just say, to help me kind of frame a sense of the discussion, since the Planning Commission is not part of that discussion, and I understand that today is the one and only day that we'll be considering this project before it moves forward. Appreciate that.
I would say that we have, well, I work in transportation, so I always think it's a major thing. But
it's all relative, isn't
yeah.
it? Yes. Uh-huh.
No, but what it is we're working with like the queuing information and the actual design, and that's where we think that there could be like the most impact. If there's going to be impact, is it about any kind of queuing going out to the street from the area that will serve the hotel and the retail, but also the public, the one that will seem like it's a downtown parking lot. And And so there have been, in your design, in the plans that you received, there were design changes that were made by the applicant to respond to that. And we are also looking at some queuing and other studies to make sure that we're not creating that effect on the street that I was just describing that we had concerns about. And I think we need to perfect that design as we go along, and there is some flexibility to do that. But that's where we are. It's really just in the discussion phase so far. And we would really need to perfect it, because it's really an art to make sure that the parking lots work well. As you may know, my experience is that they're all a little bit individual. And
So how different is this from the previous project, again, against which we're considering substantial conformance? What we're just talking about now, in your scope of your jurisdiction, so to speak.
I would say that the major difference is that the entrance to the, I'm going to call it the public lot, was, and the valet entrance, as shown here, were essentially reversed, so that there was, any queuing would be farther along down the street on Helena.
And then lastly, and I don't know if Mr. Armstrong, you might answer this, I'm looking for the next milestone around some of these discussions and decisions that the city may have required the applicant to meet. I know we've established in our negotiations with the applicant certain milestones and obligations that they have to hit. Are these changes within a certain date milestone or date deadline?
Well, I'm not sure I understand your question, but I'll try. And right now, there's a schedule in the current SCD, and they're a little behind on the improvements to the public improvements on the west side of State Street. What they're asking for is basically, originally we wanted them to move promptly on the east side of State Street. This would then consolidate that with the rest of the project, and do it all at once. So that's the biggest change in terms of the schedule.
Are you anticipating that the discussions, I know this is anticipatory, but are you anticipating that the discussions that the applicant is having with Public Works and engineers and so forth will fall within the next set of deadlines so that?
No, I think in my discussions with Public Works in terms of working out these issues about the queuing and the driveway entrances, that needs to be resolved relatively quickly. But in terms of the critical path, I don't think it's going to affect the completion of the project.
Okay, that's where I was going with my line of questioning. Thanks so much. And then lastly, I want to ask about the corner of State Street and East Mason. And I appreciate, let me see, perhaps of the architects. I understand that to some, this is viewed as, coming from the wharf, coming from Cabrillo, the gateway to downtown. Looking east, it's the gateway to the one gateway to the funk zone. So I would like to get a sense from you, from a design sense, how you came up with this, given that it's on the corner of two gateways in a sense. And one area, the funk zone, is an accelerated state of evolution in and of itself. So could you speak to how you came up with the design that we have here before us? It's on the State and East Mason, and what you thought the benefits were, the aesthetic benefits and public engagement benefits?
Got the short straw, huh?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. Two things. One was, of course, our retail along State Street. Compared to our prior iteration and the original entitlement where that was engaged being on State Street, that was probably our first biggest movement. The second being the plaza. We wanted to design a plaza that was in relationship with the new location of our commercial, the location of our lobby, which in the original entitlement used to be on Area C, and the prior SCD approval, it was in Area B and remains to be on Area B. But the plaza design was probably our next big step. Ever since we went to HLC in January, they had some comments about the openness of the plaza and how inviting it was to the general public and how the relationship was to transients walking up State Street. Since then, we've almost doubled the setback off Mason Street to create that opening. We've also eliminated some of the taller and more perhaps to some obstructive planters that were raised that led up to the elevated plaza. We've also enlarged the landscaped area by almost, I think, 60 or 70% than the last approval. We've also located the steps now, located both, walking up State Street, you'd be able to get up through the steps to the elevated plaza or come across the lobby and go up the steps. So the steps are now open on both streets. The opening or the linear foot, like we talked about earlier, is vastly improved, being that it's open on both sides of the street. The quality of this open space is immensely better than the last project because of the reduced massing around its perimeter. 2 street openings, 135-foot setback, you still have your right-of-way before the next building mass. The last project had a 3-story mass along Mason Street. I'm now answering probably your second question. How did you engage your entrance to the ever so growing funk zone? I think that removing this large mass was a big first step in addressing that. Trying to locate this commercial on the back, which we went back and forth, thought to be appropriate commercial activity and people draw and a good entrance. I do want to go back to the question you asked, transportation. We met with transportation prior to submitting the sets that you have today, and were able to address some of their comments within a few days, actually, some of which were related to queuing, others related to parallel parking. We've agreed and committed to continue working with them as we get into development drawings before we come back to them and for further review for permits. As we continue to work with HLC, I'm sure there will be some improvements to the landscape palette that we're proposing. Phil Suiting is going to help us get through the next level of what that plaza will look and feel like. I hope that helps answer a little bit the question. You want to add something?
I just want to point out.
Could you come up to a microphone, please, Mr. Shields?
Also want to point out that, in a way, once Helena Street starts getting even more interesting than it already is, I'm an artist and I rented a studio down here for years, about 20 years ago, so I know the area well. And what I imagine happening is, sure, a lot of people will walk up State Street, but a substantial amount of people will also come up Helena. And as this area improves and changes slightly, who knows what's going to happen on this side. But we've provided a space here that's, possibly it's got high vaulted ceilings. It would be interesting for a wine tasting room, for instance, or a gallery or something like that, with exterior dining or seating. So we feel that this element really helps push forward whatever activity it gives it a chance to develop in a more interesting, positive way. And we've also incorporated, I don't know, all of you have noticed the murals along Mason Street, the art murals. We have a very flat, big wall along here, which is adjacent to our parking area, that we don't have those elevations here to show you, but we've actually included 5 big mural spots because we understand we'll be replacing those where the new hotel entry happens. We're going to be adding them back on Helena Street. So we're keeping alive the funk zone ideas and trying to enhance that and move that whole idea forward.
Mr. Shields, and then, Mr. Chair, this is my last question. So I'm going back to the site plan. This is CA301. The red line delineation in the top 2 views, could you walk me through which is the most recently approved project versus what we are looking at today? Again, I'm continuing to do kind of before and after evaluation in my own mind. Area C Mason Street elevation.
Okay.
Just as an example, yeah.
Yes, the red line is the prior project that was 2001, I believe.
Original, so that's original.
And then the blue line is the more recent approved project. And so we're substantially down for the original, and we're also quite a bit down in certain areas, lower than the most recent approval. And that includes height, especially along Mason Street, since essentially this blue mass, which used to be on Mason Street, is no longer there, and the building has been pushed back 110 feet or 90-something feet in this situation. So big reduction in mass as well as height and setback.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Those are my questions for now.
Thank you. Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question about Area C, and the part that on the ground floor is labeled Commercial B, and the encroachment into the setback there. And I think somewhere in there it was said that that's, did I say C? I meant Area A.
Area A?
Area A. No wonder you all looked confused. Okay. Okay. Upper right, there's that commercial portion there, that which was brought forward somewhere in the text, as I recall, to line up with the existing building. Was that on the original approved plan, that encroachment?
The answer to that is, this is the historic facade. This is the new addition. That 3-foot setback was a request that was made by our neighbors at the Harborview Inn and trying to match or get closer to their building footprint.
Okay, so it's not in what?
Not the existing building of the Californian, but the existing condition of the building to our neighbors, at our neighbors'
Right. building. Okay. Okay. I think that was my only question at this point. Thank you.
Mr. Campanella?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of questions in my mind relative to substantial conformity, and then if we can, I think as you mentioned, I have some follow-up questions to what was discussed relative to some suggestions or considerations. On the substantial conformity, the public parking, there has always been a public parking requirement for the project, I believe, and in the prior rendition, public parking, would that have been located in all 3 parking garages under the 3 buildings, or was it confined to one building?
Mr. Campanella, Chair, Mr. Campanella, the public parking was always located on Area C. It was the underground parking on Area B and the interior surface parking on Area A were both designed to provide hotel or timeshare guests with parking.
Okay, great. And of course, you know, we appreciate the efficiency now of consolidating in one space and separate entries for each one. Secondly, on open space requirements, was there a specific amount of open space that was required by some definition, and how do we compare it to what was originally required?
Commissioner Campanella, there is no requirement for open space in this zone, and there was no requirement called out in the conditions of approval for the project. So it identified paseos and plazas as being important, and so we look at those areas, but there were no numbers identified.
Okay. I'll save my other questions till later. Thank you.
I have several questions for staff and then for the applicant. Well, might not be for staff. Can somebody conclusively speak to the east side trolley stop that's still not on the plans and where that's possibly going to be or not be?
So the existing trolley stop, as sorry, the existing trolley stop is on the east side of State Street, just north of the intersection, right in this location. And that stop is proposed to move into this location right here. So it would be moving to the near side of the intersection.
With seating and covers also?
There are benches proposed, however, they are not covered.
I think that was in the original conditions, though, right? Covered and lit.
I would have to confirm that.
Okay, I'll find it for you. And then in relationship to trip counts, I'm perplexed, but I'm always perplexed on that science anyhow, that a hotel generates less than timeshare, because I would think you'd come and park at a timeshare for a week, but you're at a hotel for a couple days and going back and forth. But in either event, and for lack of a better word, I may be misphrasing it, but our trip credits, I think they were applied in the original 2001 process due to the easy access to both pedestrian improvements and transit, so that the process in the math takes into consideration and gives you credits based on if those are good. And are those same credits applied in the math for the current proposal, or the same consideration given based on trolley, transit, and pedestrian improvements?
Mr. Chair, Planning Commissioners, Rob Dayton. I'll have Stacy Wilson come up if I can't answer, but I can tell you in relevance to the original project, yes, there weren't credits. There were existing buildings on the site that had square footage that could have been occupied and restored as retail, and we assume that would take place. What we're comparing here now is as has been talked about throughout the hearing, what we're comparing is now the last substantial conformance to this one. And that's where I'd like to call on Stacy Wilson to give you.
I think I'm not asking a question right. So I saw reference in the original EIR and traffic process that as part of the determination of the trip numbers, that credits are given based on some determination of access to public transit, to shuttles, and to better pedestrian ease of access rather than worse. Does that just continue to hold true throughout the whole process?
Okay, yeah, I think my memory is jogging on that. I think it was a 25%. We did a reduction based on internet ITE numbers.
Okay.
And fast forward 10 years now, we have a traffic model that actually shows that it's more than 25%. So yeah, that theory plays today.
But it's still valid.
That's right.
Okay. Thanks. Then is the valet parking and queuing that's being described on East Mason, is that actually allowed on a public right-of-way?
We're going to have Derek Bailey, our traffic engineer, come and address that for you.
Good afternoon, Derek Bailey with Traffic Engineering. Chairman Jordan, currently there's nothing in municipal code that allows us to reserve space in the public right-of-way for valet parking operations. However, we have been in discussions with the City Attorney's Office about establishing something in the municipal code to address this project.
So literally, if that's what goes forward, we'll remedy it with an adjustment.
Right. What would happen today if that type of operation were on the street is, if you can imagine valet operations taking place on street, a member of the public could pull in and park there, and there'd be nothing prohibiting them from being there and just leaving their car there. So that's something we would need to address.
Okay. Thank you. Then the prior project also talked about the setback on Area A relative to Mission Creek, and it mentioned some work that would be done for creek restoration, some type of bank work. And I realize 14 years ago, the bank might not even be in the same place soon because of all the other projects going on down there. But will that, what was intended then, if it's still possible now, will that carry over to this project also?
Chair Jordan, yes, that is correct. The building still maintains the 25-foot setback from the new top of bank, which is not the current top of bank, and all the conditions addressing restoration and planting will carry forward.
Okay. Then I have some questions for the applicant. In Area B, there's a really nice overhead picture that shows trees and stuff. And then you turn the page and you look at a site plan, and that back area on Helena is called a loading zone with no trees and nice stuff. So could you walk me through what's really happening back at the back end of that Paseo?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. As we mentioned earlier, we did meet with Transportation and had comments from Public Works a couple weeks ago, and we were able to meet with them and discuss the loading issue. We are seeking some modifications to the curb line here. We're talking about possibly eliminating this extension and having an even curb line. We would prefer to see this as our hotel operator, golf cart, and bicycle storage area, not so much as a truck delivery. Staff was a little bit concerned about the back out and safety for pedestrians walking through Helena. So right. So this area will be mostly for our golf cart, hotel operated golf cart.
So if you did that, you would envision if you were paseoing through from State Street, you would eventually get funneled down to a sidewalk access situation there to get out to Helena?
There is a ramp back here that could get you to this grade level. Right now, the Paseo is about 30 inches or so elevated from.
But that interior section that's under the trees right now, that would not be part of the Paseo?
No, it would not be.
Okay.
So the two different entry points to the Paseo would be from State Street. There is a ramp that would lead you up, and then another ramp in the back that would connect you through Helena, and our connection through Mason Street. There's right now a proposed few steps to get you up to the elevated Paseo, or you can enter through the lobby and access the elevator. We're still in discussion with building and safety, whether or not if this needs to be an enclosed condition or open and therefore more accessible.
Okay. And then I swear at one of the meetings I was at talking about the changes, that the removal of the underground parking in this area allowed you to bring the Paseo back down to grade?
Almost, not quite.
But not quite. So it's still got a couple steps.
Correct. It used to be almost 5.5 feet above
Okay.
grade. We're now about 2.5.
Significant gain then.
Oh, yes.
Right?
So
Okay.
this view shed through the Paseo, both in width and height, has been improved from the original EIR approved view study, which I have a backup as well, but Allison already explained that in her presentation.
And then on that section 2, you also made the statement earlier that this Paseo now was a foot wider.
Yes.
Than one of the many other prior iterations. The page that's in our plan that shows all the levels, the 4 levels, and all 3 versions of this doesn't appear that way to the eye. It appears that the current proposed version with the little patios is tighter both than the previously approved and the original entitlement version when you just look at it this way. So I'm curious as to whether we're really widening it or reducing it.
It's significantly wider than the original. The original used to have a pinching point where the view was even further impinged. So it looked like more of a funnel effect, whereas in the last iteration, we've not only aligned it so it's completely parallel, it was also wider. And since then, we were able to gain yet another foot. I can try to pull that slide if you'd like.
I guess it just doesn't look that way to the eye on your sheet. It might.
It is a small scale.
You
It's
might be measuring square feet, and I'm just doing naked eye linear, but it doesn't look. It looks. The current one looks significantly narrower in the middle of the building than the first version. So.
On the scale drawings, it's definitely wider. I can attest to that.
And then could you, on just an overall site plan that was up there before, could you walk me through your access points to the public parking lot, how many there are and where are they, as a pedestrian?
Yes. Again, as we consolidated the parking, we still wanted to maintain a separate entrance for the public versus the hotel valet. So currently, if you were valeting your car, you would drop it off here in some of the designated valet on-street.
I'm sorry, let me be more specific. I'm interested just in the surface level public parking, the first floor level public parking, not the hotel people, and if I was a pedestrian.
If you wanted to self-park.
I parked.
Yes.
I parked and I walked away and I may have gone any direction. So what are my choices coming back to the parking lot for access as a pedestrian into the parking lot?
There are two ways
there's one
of
right there.
Right. There's 2 points of entry
Okay.
right now. One off of State Street adjacent to the Visitor Information Center, which
Okay.
was critical to maintain. The other is located adjacent to this commercial right off of Mason. There is a sloping grade, or sloping almost sidewalk, but within the arcade that gets you to this elevated level. So past the first or second arcade, you're already flush with the plaza finished floor.
Okay.
Those are your 2 points of entrance.
And there wouldn't be anything off of Helena directly, or would you just walk down the driveway?
I'm not sure if in the future there might be an opening where the bikes are located. There might be some safety concerns with that, and I think we have to dive into more design development drawings with
Okay.
transportation.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have. So if anybody has any more questions? Ms. Peugeot.
Yes, I have a couple of smaller follow-up questions. Thank you. The first one is for staff. What is the parking requirement now? What is the minimum parking space number required for this new proposal?
Sorry, Commissioner Peugeot, the project with the currently proposed amount of square footage and hotel rooms requires 246 parking stalls.
Okay, thank you. And then my other follow-up question is for the applicant. Just something that perplexes me, not knowing the hotel industry. The reason for consolidating all the rooms in one structure, what drove that change rather than having the rooms, or two, I'm sorry, but rather than having the rooms dispersed as they were before?
Thank you, Commissioner Peugeot. There was a couple of considerations. One, as you can imagine, having a hotel that's bisected by streets where you're scattering people in all different directions from an efficiency standpoint is not optimal. And so the consolidation of the rooms on areas A and B really created two very discrete. You have the more active area on area B with the lobby and the plaza, and area A backing up to the creek was more of the quiet zone, and you have the spa there. Area C actually backs up to the train tracks. And so one of the things that we looked at in that regard was it really practical to have hotel rooms, in that area, and again, really from a efficiency servicing standpoint of dispersing the rooms in all directions and the general flow. And so what we tried to do was consolidate uses where they would occur most appropriately. And Area C has the parking, it has the event space, it has the public areas, and so that really became the more public and active area for that purpose, as well as the retail, and then areas in B discreetly for the respective hotel uses. We tried to be thoughtful in not only making this a compatible use, but that one that would function.
Thank you. And just one follow-up detail. I think I saw somewhere that there is a breakfast room or a hotel-run food.
Yes, there's
area?
actually there are 2 areas that there's probably 3 areas that are restaurant oriented. Thank you. Okay, so on Area A, if you look at the corner, which I think is most affectionately known as Rocky Galente's former area, that is intended to be kind of a boulangerie, cafe style, venue. So we have a number of examples of that in the city, but it's kind of a more breakfast and lunch oriented, coffee, croissant type of thing, and again, and kind of consistent with a more quiet zone there. On Area B, if you look on the front, you'll have 2 commercial spaces on Area B, and to the right, where you actually see Area B, that's intended to be the hotel bar and restaurant area that opens up to the interior plaza. And so that's, again, in the concept of the more active area. And then if you look on Area C, on the corner there, which was mentioned in the presentation, that's intended to be a restaurant, whether that'll actually be operated as a hotel restaurant or as a outside vendor. That has yet to be determined. But that area opens up to public seating and to the public plaza. And again, a lot of this is intended to really activate these spaces, to encourage pedestrian activity and public utilization. And 2 quick follow-up responses. One, your question regarding, and that was, I believe, Commissioner Schwartz, in terms of the vision of not only activating State Street, but in activating Mason Street with the Funk Zone and really creating that gateway that you talked about, having those public spaces that really draw people in. And we have, we really see this as a gathering place and as an amenity to the entire area, not just to the property. And so consequently, we have wine gatherings. We could have, what was the name of the event that they had recently? New Noise. We really see this as being an encouraging public utilization, and so that those areas become almost seamless. And I think that the architects did a really great job on the corner of Helena and Mason in taking a use that is very much consistent with what's happening in the Funk Zone, a gallery or wine type venue, and trying to create that consistency as we flow. So we see this all as kind of being an amenity that is not separate from, but kind of seamless too. Secondly, on Area B, when you were talking about the loading area, we were able to eliminate through the design not only another hole, which I know is a topic of much discussion in this town, but also we were able to eliminate a drive ramp, because we don't have an underground space there, so we don't have to dig out a garage, dewater it. But also the drive ramp that was occurring on Helena was in prior HLC hearings commented as being somewhat of an eyesore from Helena as to the back of the property. You're looking in and then down into a garage ramp, and that was eliminated, which we think is also a positive benefit aesthetically as well as functionally to the property.
Thank you.
Commissioner Peugeot, sorry, I just want to correct my statement previously. There are 226 spaces required for the use.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some additional parking and transportation circulation questions. So back to valet parking. If we change our city policy for this project then, Mr. Bailey, thank you for coming back up, how does that affect the other hotels within the city boundaries that do not have public parking, valet parking currently in the public right-of-way? What are their rights in coming to the city to request the same sort of allowance? Mm-hmm.
Currently, we don't have any policy that addresses valet parking.
Right.
We've been researching what other cities do, particularly in the Los Angeles area, where there are more established valet parking programs. So it's something that we would have to work with individuals on a case-by-case basis. We're envisioning something along the lines of a permit in the public right-of-way to conduct those types of activities, but in terms of exactly how that would operate, that's something we'd have to work out with Mr. Wiley's office. Some of the things we're concerned about is that the operators of the valet parking have driver's licenses, are insured, where they're parking. We've heard anecdotally of some valet services that will go into parking lots with 75-minute free parking and shuffle, so that they're never really paying for parking, and by the end of the night they leave with minimal charges. So, and as well, just so the valet operators have permission from parking lot owners to actually utilize those. But like I said, it's probably something that we'd have to deal with on a case-by-case basis. And also the exact street where those activities take place. Some streets are more appropriate for those types of activities than others. Mason Street's a very low volume street, low speed. We're not that concerned that it's a safety issue. If it was a busier arterial street, it would need more scrutiny.
Commissioner, can I make one comment on this? In the prior SCD, it did include the valet, so this is not a new concept in the prior SCD, and that we have exceeded the amount of potential space loss by quite a exponentially in additional public non-required spaces. So I think this would function very much like a restaurant might in terms of valet utilization, which you see kind of throughout town as well.
Well, this goes to my point of confusion, though. In the prior, to follow up Mr. Rosenfeld's comment, so it's referenced in the prior SCD, yet we don't currently have an allowance for it on the city books, right? Yet it's part of the current proposed project that's before us today. So you can see I'm trying to understand how to consider it. If this moves forward, and it's got to move forward expeditiously if that's the case, and what we do about valet parking. I mean, fairly immediately, right? Yeah.
It is, and it's actually something that we'd already been having discussions with the police department and the city attorney's office regarding, just because there are some other valet operations taking place in the city right now that are not permitted to be in the public right-of-way, but because it's not specifically addressed in municipal code, we can't regulate it.
So, Mr. Wiley, we're silent on it. Is that kind of the way to view it? And
Commissioner Schwartz, we are silent on it, but as mentioned, we've been having some what we consider problems with it, the shuffling and the parking. And so we have been enforcing on this and saying you can't do this. We see restaurants doing it and using the public right-of-way to do valet parking. And what we find is typically this is a commercial operation. Sometimes the restaurant cooperates, but there's no money. They're not paying the valet service. The valet service is doing it on their own. And so anyway, we've told them that's commercial use of a city street, which is not permitted, and you can't do it, and that's been effective. I think what you're correct, we don't have a policy either for or against this, and what Mr. Bailey is saying is the time has probably come for us to develop a policy. We don't even know that we need to change an ordinance to do this, but to develop a policy and to allow it under some circumstances. We would have the curb, for example, indicate that it's dedicated for those purposes. It wouldn't be functionally much different, it seems to me, than a loading zone. But in this case, we're not talking about using a city parking lot to shuffle. We're talking about dedicated valet parking areas in this project. So it's odd that this was always part of this project, as I recall, and it's just never occurred to us before that it was an issue. It's occurred to us now.
But I find curious that we're this far along, and it was part of a previous SCD, but however, we don't have a city policy that explicitly states we can do this. So we'll have to move pretty expeditiously, won't we, to devise one?
And now we have, and we think the time is to just develop some policies on this. that would allow it as long as it's not using city parking to do it, because that would be a commercial operation of a city parking structure.
To develop a city policy that would explicitly allow this, what kind of an effort is that in terms of?
Commissioner Schwartz, you know, I have to say that even some of these queuing issues, we've got a land development team and engineers, public works employees are a large part. Any project goes through what I would call the engineering weeds as part of the land development team. And what we're talking about here is we're down in the engineering weeds, and this really doesn't have anything to do with substantial conformance.
The reason I'm pressing on it, and you can lead me in another direction if appropriate, but it seems to me that the assumption that there will be valet parking vis-a-vis the Area C and all the parking provided there, and the golf cart with the valets and going back and forth around a lane, to me, this seems like an important piece of the project and the assumptions around which we're allowing the applicant to move forward and traffic circulation assumptions surrounding all of that. So that's why I'm pressing to understand what's missing from our city policy, what needs to go into effect, and in what timeline can that happen so this project could stay on track if all the decision makers, grant it to do that. So,
well, I think in terms of the timeline, I would believe it would be our intention to develop a written agreement with this developer, with this applicant, to deal with the valet parking and to, just make it clear what our assumptions are. There would be an exhibit, for example, that would show where it could occur on Mason Street. It would make it clear that the valet parking would have to use the dedicated valet spaces on there in Area C. And again, it's getting back to, we're not necessarily opposed to this sort of thing and never have been. We haven't dealt with it, and we're going to deal with it in this case, in this particular project, and it's really kind of an administrative thing that can be dealt with.
Okay. I'll leave the rest of my thoughts for comments on that. So my last question, going back to the discussion about what was going to be loading, now we're on Helena again. Loading, but now perhaps golf cart, bicycle parking. If this area that has been identified for loading, maybe we could, if somebody wouldn't mind putting that page up on the PowerPoint again. Would the golf cart, bicycle use move the loading to somewhere else on the property? On Area B, I suppose? Again, I'm going to traffic, circulation. That's what I'm looking at here. And while that's being put up, I want to say to Mr. Bailey's comment, today East Mason has low usage. We have a number of projects coming online, and I think there are going to be big changes in this whole area of our city. So we have to be somewhat anticipatory, I think, and forward-thinking, and not kind of look on a micro scale, just on a block by block, project by project. So, okay, now we're up on Helena.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, where that goes from that location would be up to the applicant, and I don't think we're at the point to where they propose that would be, so we would just look to the team to tell us.
Okay. Okay, I will make some comments at an appropriate time about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wiley, I guess I erred and didn't follow up on earlier comments, but I am reasonably confused on the whole conformance comparison. I've sat through a presentation from Mr. Armstrong where he made it clear that this particular comparison, so if you speak, should be addressed back to the 2001 approval and not take into conformance considerations the various SCDs that happen between now and then, which frankly I think is a benefit to the applicant if you go back to 2001. And now I hear something a little different today, and then I also hear the applicant kind of liking that, well, presuming he likes those two comparisons, but he'd like to pull items that benefit him out of the middle SCDs and apply those to the new version, but ignore some others that might have been in the prior SCDs. So could you help me still with that confusion?
Mr. Chair, I hope so.
Or there's just no help for me.
I
know.
have to, I have to say, in all the meetings in recent times about this project, this question never came up. So we didn't actually get our heads together apparently on this point, and my answer was probably at variance with what the planning staff or maybe Mr. Armstrong, how they would view it. And I have to say, my answer was a lawyer's answer. In other words, the question was asked, is there a vested project here? And that's what kind of my starting point. And I think there may well be a vested project here, and that's the prior substantial conformance determination. And so as a lawyer, I think if, in theory at least, the property owner could say, you know what, I've got a building permit for that project, I'm going to build it. And we really would be hard-pressed, I think, to say otherwise or to convince a judge otherwise. Again, that's not likely to happen. This property owner does not want to build that project, apparently. But that's where I was coming from, and to me, that's the relevant comparison, what they could build with what they're proposing to build now. I guess finally, I think maybe the answer is it's all part of the totality. What were we, when this project was in front of the Planning Commission in 2001, and it was clearly a discretionary approval, what was the Planning Commission concerned about? What were, they looking at that time? And that's clearly a relevant consideration. And that's why when people, show what the size, bulk, and scale was back then, I think it is relevant.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You asked the question that I was going to ask. No, that's quite all right. But the way Ms. DeBusk put it at the site visit was that technically it's the 2001 approval that we are comparing with, but that all the others need to be taken into consideration. Would you concur with that?
Yes, that's my understanding. I think part of this is, planning staff always worries about project creep. When someone comes back and they get 10% more of the project, and then it's like all of a sudden you're 30% from the original approval. I personally believe that project creep is something that you really should have with a substantial conformance determination, because you're not supposed to be getting more through substantial conformance. You're supposed to be changing within the same original parameters. So I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No.
Okay, then for discussion and recommendations to the commission. Unless staff has any further input they want to make or guidance? Okay. Don't make me start at one end. Mr. Campanella.
Thank you, Chair Jordan. In looking strictly at substantial conformity, I think I can see this being substantially conform with what the intent was, not only of the initial approval, but as it evolved through the process relative to what was trying to be created at this gateway. I think the efficiency of the building forms for the hotel units are very efficient. You've got double-loaded corridors in each segment of B, the two segments of B, with open space or separation in the middle. Area A with the courtyard allows for double loading as well as some open space and breathing area for the residents. And you've kept potential conflict off Area C between public parking and the rental units, and segregation of amenities and services for the hotel occupants, and what a good level of service would be for them. I think view corridors were considered, breathing room was considered. To be in substantial conformity with as this project went through. I do have a couple of comments, if we're still reserving comments for suggestions, or this strictly, if I may, which continues with some of the comments that were made previously. And I did look at the tape of the January 30th HLC meeting on this, and I'm glad the architect is local and understands what's going on down in the Funk Zone and on Helena. There are activities that are spontaneous and fire eaters and everything else, as you know, that occur at various times. So I like the fact that there's a space being provided for expressive art near the parking garage, at least, that can blend in whatever they do alongside the Beacons building in the future and allows some area for free-form expression, as we call it, or First Thursday, 0 Doc 30, after First Thursday is over. As far as the area for, let's call it common use, I presume that it's intended for that purpose and not strictly for the hotel guests, that it's not an area for the cocktail tables to be up prior to a wedding or some other function, and that people would be able to utilize it. My suggestion would be to carry forward from the idea of blending it in with the Funk Zone and being an entry, which I appreciate and think is very important, is the fact that you give an area for the expression of art that people can see. Okay? There, a lot of the public and visitors, including people with kids and people staying at your rooms, are not necessarily going to go wine tasting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as maybe the bachelorette parties will and others that go down there for events. So their only experience with the creatives might be right on this site. So I would look at the layout relative to, do you want enclosed glass portico, for example, which seems to be a little area that was expanded on to service your banquet rooms, stairways, versus creating an area where expressive art could either be rotated, similar to what's being done at the Pay Cafe, on their folding covers for their windows, art shows, and allow the locals, maybe even to help if you've got some time, to input what they would see might be a good expression to have this work from a functionality standpoint. There are people that would volunteer real quickly to give you some advice and maybe give you volunteer help. And I think if you get that type of community input, it may be something that could be really used for those purposes in the future. So I'd really look at this area, not so much from size, so to speak, but of flexibility and functionality, and trying to be expressive of what the Funk Zone's really about, so that ultimately, as the families would be able to progress through the rest of the area, and it'd be something else for the kids to do when the parents go get wine and give them a babysitter. The other I'm glad work is being done on Helena relative to the back out and, by in Area B. I think, respect for certain districts goes both ways. And I think if you start introducing more revival-type urban features like these bulb outs and things like that, you're taking away from what's already there. So I'm glad you're looking at that to try to make that somewhat consistent. The other suggestion might be, and I am not in the hotel business either, but you might take a look at your first-floor rooms that border on Helena. I mean, that may be desirable if you're into the Funk Zone scene, or it may not be so good. That would be a perfect place, I think, for some type of small-type artisan or some other thing with flavor that could be a commercial space at the lower level. I'm not so concerned about the upper, but maybe that lower first floor. We have not seen the elevations, but I would guess that might be a little more simplistic level of detail that might blend in better with the transition to the Funk Zone eclectic look. I appreciate the time to give those comments, but as far as substantial conformity, I can really see that this does a good job of conforming, and I'm happy they made all these efforts not only at conforming, but also at improvement. Thanks.
Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me. We're stuck in the old ways here. Well, there's no doubt that this project has had a long and tortuous path to get to this point. I understand that we're not talking about the public improvements on State Street today. I wish we were, because I'm not convinced that impeding the traffic flow down there is a benefit to the city. I understand that topic will be discussed by the City Council in 2 weeks, so maybe a good discussion will occur there. This long and tortuous path has certainly been difficult for the city and for the owner, but maybe in the long run it will result in a better project. I think that what we've seen here today that is proposed is an improved project from what was originally proposed, and it's certainly an improvement over a couple of the iterations of previous substantial conformance determinations. So maybe in the long run, in the long term, the delay had at least some benefit. I would say to Mr. Armstrong that I believe that the proposal as proposed is definitely in conformance with the original approved project, and I would urge him to fine for that. And as I said before, I think a lot of what has come out of this is definitely an improvement, and it should benefit the city and the owner of the project. I won't go into all the details and so forth. I think we beat those enough today. That's the end of my comments. Thank you.
Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, it has been a long and torturous path, but I think it has resulted in a better project. And the fact that it's now an all hotel, the roof heights have been reduced overall. Paseo has been widened a bit. I like the commercial at Mason and Helena, and it certainly makes sense to have to reduce the number of sites in which you have hotel rooms. And the construction all at one time, that is certainly a benefit, I think, to have it done at one time. The views are improved over the original plan. However, they are not improved over the substantial conformance of 2010, and I have some concern about that. The 2010 Paseo, or on Area C, it was more inviting. It wasn't closed off as much as this is, and I understand why you've done that. But I think you could do a compromise between 2010 and the amount of frontage on State Street of retail, and open it up a bit more. And I think that would make it conform more with that SCD. And on Area A, the part I was questioning where the neighbor has asked that it be brought further out in the street, I've had the experience of walking past that, and as a pedestrian, that constricted area, and especially if the widening sidewalks goes away, is not a pleasant experience. And it would lessen the amount of encroachment, and I think it would be more in conformance if it lined up with the existing front of the California Hotel. Well, it was the California Hotel. So, but overall, I think this is an improvement, and I join everybody in hoping that it all goes forward. Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Pujol?
Thank you. I'm going to consult some of my notes here. First of all, I wanted to just describe what guided me in my review of the substantial conformity determination. I looked at the whole of the project, what they could build now, as our city attorney has informed us about, and I also looked at the city council resolution for the original 2001 approval of the project, which is quite extensive and comprehensive and lays out the findings, the goals, really what we're trying to achieve in the development of this project. It also addresses size, bulk, scale, views, traffic, and of course references the environmental review documents that were certified. Also mention that original approval, as was brought up before, was very well vetted out in detail. So the basis of that approval, which included the Coastal Act policy consistency and the environmental impacts and the basic goals for that area of State Street, I think are very well established. And to me, a project that is amended, or excuse me, I should say, revised under substantial conformity needs to very clearly continue to meet those goals and objectives. And the good news for me is I think this substantial conformity request does that. There are some very key components to the project overall that are so integrated with the original approval that you can't really pull them apart and look at them individually. Area A, B, C, the sidewalk improvements, all of that incorporates the whole of what that project approval was. And so for me, the fact that those areas at a very starting point are still intact and not being proposed for major change is part of why I think substantial conformity can work. So the rest of it, for me, really are some comments, a few comments that I have on the actual individual change requests. And for that, I would refer to page 6, item 3B, where staff has listed what those changes are, and I'll go through those and just make my comments on those. The first one is changing from a mixture of hotel units and timeshares to entirety hotel units. I have no problem with that. I think that is completely fine under a substantial conformity determination. The second one is the slight increase in amount of commercial square footage. That also completely consistent, and I think is also consistent with at least one of the conditions I saw that actually required a little bit of bump up from the very first proposal. Totally consistent. The next one, consolidating all hotel units onto area A and B. Again, I find it consistent and can understand and think quite reasonable the owner's request and reasoning for wanting to do that. The fifth one, consolidate, number 4. Number 4, additional square footage on areas A and B and reduce square footage on area C. That one I do have a few comments on. For area C, my comments are as follows. The street front elevation for area C, the original approval, I believe from what I could tell, included an arcade that was much more functional than what I see on this elevation. What I believe occurs on this iteration is that there are some arches, but it doesn't appear to me to be deep enough to be a true arcade. And in taking a look at what the kind of consistent pattern is for area A and area B, where there is more of a usable arcade, it makes sense to me that this project should continue and match what I believe was the original proposal, which actually had some depth and usage to that. So I would ask the staff and Mr. Armstrong and the applicant to take a look at that and see if some improvement can be made to make those more usable. I think, do you understand with the facade that I'm talking about? Okay. My second comment on Area C is the plaza. I appreciate the improvements. I think they are improvements. I like the kind of formulation, again, the stairs on those areas and the fact that it's a continuous onto 2 street frontages and kind of makes the public sidewalk space and the public park space kind of just like flow one into the other. I do, however, think that the design, the specific design and the landscape components are not as refined or reflective of, say, Santa Barbara tradition that I believe fits best with the area. There's a lot of grass. I don't see incorporation of maybe doing the same kind of thing, but maybe with more natives and less just palm trees, which kind of is not complex and interesting enough, in my view. And also, I don't see shade components that are strong enough. or accent furniture gathering spaces. I think there's more work that needs to be done in that, so I would hope that the historic landmarks will take a very close look at that, and that what is now very conceptual design will evolve more in that direction. The other part of that public space I'd like to point out, and I believe other commissioners may have made that comment as well, is that there needs to be strong cues to the public and the pedestrians and the passerbys that this is an area that is inviting and can be used by the public and not just the front lawn of a hotel. And I don't really quite get that strongly enough right now. So I think those are areas that need to be worked on for Area C. For Area B, I have a comment regarding the Paseo. I'm concerned that the back end of that Paseo disappears from a public pedestrian perspective, and I appreciate that there is technically, physically, a way to get down to Helena Street if you're cutting through from State, or if you're trying to get from Helena to State. But again, there's no visual, it's not prominent enough, there's no visual clue, and it doesn't look inviting. Right now, I took another site visit on my own down there and was recalling that right now, even though it's a parking lot, there is a lot of cut-through activity that goes from Helena Street in that same general area over to State. And from my view, that end needs to be more welcoming as a pass-through all the way through to Helena back and forth. The other comment I have on Area B is on the Mason Street frontage. Where the valet is. We've talked about the valet, but what I would like to see some attention paid to is how a pedestrian walking towards Helena from State on that side of the street would have access through that valet area without having to cross the street to avoid what may end up being a lot of activity in the front of that lobby and valet stop. So it's unclear to me whether right now the design accomplishes that, but I think that's something that should be looked at to make sure that it wouldn't impede a pedestrian, especially if someone happens to have children or a wheelchair and would have to feel maybe compelled to walk out into the street to walk around valet activity or across the street to the other side. I completely understand the need for the valet. I'm not objecting to the use of it, but I just think it needs to be looked at carefully. And I think that is my last comment. Thanks.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to start sort of succinctly and narrowly and speak to substantial conformance. I am going to find in support of substantial conformance, and without going through the kind of exhaustive list because Ms. Peugeot has already done that. I think between the goals of the applicant that Mr. Fell laid out in his March 4th letter to Mr. Armstrong, as well as the staff report, specifically what we have from page 6 through page 14. On 6, the proposed changes, and then on page 14, the conclusion. With the project we have before us today, with all the information we have before us today, and with that caveat, I'm going to find it in substantial conformance. Having said that, I'd like to bridge over to some questions I had and related concerns, and I'll just say, kind of with a nod to staff, depending upon what happens with valet parking, city policy, Helena changes on that back end and potential impacts to traffic circulation, that could be significant in my view. I don't know what that's going to look like, which is why I was a bit concerned that today is our one and only day to review the project. So I'm just hoping that there are ways to, in a nuanced fashion and yet effectively, accommodate the design and the goals that we have before us today so that, number one, there are not substantial changes made that would then, I don't know what that would trigger, I'm not going to get into that right now, and secondly, that would continue to move the project forward. Moving the project forward. Let me say in general, I'm so pleased that we are at this point with this project in this area of our city. The public has said it best. They've eagerly anticipated this. It's a long time coming. We now have an experienced hotel developer as the property owner and applicant today. So I'm confident that with your track record, Mr. Rosenfeld, I think many of us know what that is, that the right thing is going to be done. We have a golden opportunity in this area of our city to not just get something built, get more hotel space, more restaurant, more public engagement, but this is going to be sort of a once-in-a-lifetime, I feel, my lifetime at any rate, opportunity to, I don't want to say reinvent, but vitalize this area of not only Lower State Street, but the funk zone. For the first time, I moved here in 1967, so for the first time in all the years I've been a Santa Barbaran, the funk zone identity is fast evolving, and this project has an opportunity of honoring, the more traditional Santa Barbara architectural look, feel, etc., while incorporating and giving some reverence to and respect to and involvement in the evolution of the funk zone. So I wrote down Mr. Shields' comment, sense of place, this corner of State and East Mason. And to that I would say that I'm encouraging the applicant team, the design part, and staff to do something more exhilarating and creative with this corner that's manageable by the hotel operator, and that is more stimulating to both locals and visitors. That's hotel guests and others who are just in this area. This is not going to be the typical hotel compound or complex, in my opinion. It cannot be for Santa Barbara. For it to serve Santa Barbara well, and with everything I've just described, it really has to be different. So back of house can't look like all other typical hotel back of house. I think you might agree with me, Mr. Rosenfeld. I know you're smiling. So thinking outside the box creatively from a design perspective, functionality, we're really going to have to sharpen the pencils, looking at Design Arc, to do this, to make Santa Barbarans proud and have a once-in-a-lifetime pivot point to Lower State Street and the funk zone. Okay, having said that, you can see I'm getting excited about the project. I want it done, but I want it done right. So I think that the changes, the iterative changes that have occurred from 2001 to where we are today do reflect improvements in many areas that I'm not going to restate that some of my colleagues have already stated. It sounds to me like the applicant and staff are still working out, perhaps even with Mr. Armstrong, to meet the milestones, still working out some of the pieces and the operational kind of interactive nature of them. I know we're on a very aggressive timeline, and you have financially invested and otherwise invested, legally invested in hitting those milestones. That good faith says a lot to me, Mr. Rosenfeld. I just want to say. We have other projects in our county where that is not occurring, and we're watching them very carefully, and this is going to be, I think, an A-plus case where we're all doing the right thing for all concerned. So with that, I'm hoping not too much has to change, that still keeps us in conformance, but makes all the pieces work right, works effectively, and hits the milestones so we can have you finished by 2016. And with that, I think I'll just conclude by saying I appreciate everybody's significant time, substantial time that has been spent on the applicant side, the city side. I know Mr. Armstrong's been intimately involved, probably Mr. Wiley as well. This is the first time I personally have been able to vet the project as thoroughly as I have and in its current iteration. And it's exciting, and all eyes are on you, Mr. Rosenfeld. So let's get it right and let's get it done. And thank you so much.
I think there would have been a better way to welcome you to Santa Barbara. I concur with most of what I've heard on both sides of me. I am less optimistic of advice to the design process than I am of my recommendations to Mr. Armstrong to hold you accountable to some of the things that I think are important. So I'm apparently going to be the only one who doesn't just tell you conform. I'm going to take my middle choice from earlier and say you don't conform, but I'm going to give you some, and Mr. Armstrong, some ideas of what would make it conform in my mind. One is the loss of the plaza component to the Visitor Information Center in the original plan. And I don't know that it can be put back in there, but I don't know that anybody's worked really hard in looking at making that an integral part at that location of having a plaza for people who are visiting the Visitor Information Center, meeting there, thinking about where they want to go, and where they're going to stand to do that. The choices right now are on a sidewalk, in an alleyway, or in a parking lot. And I just think that that was a key component of the original considerations of part of the process of the concessions that were given to the project were the Visitor Information Center and the plaza with it. I also agree with a couple of the other comments you've heard both on Area B and Area C on what was talked about before in the original conditions, and the word was to encourage public use, not just provide for an area of public use. And in fact, in the conditions, they even went into talking about amenities such as seating areas or furniture. I don't so much have a problem with the encouragement part on Area B, but on C, I'm very leery of grass, because grass can be manipulated that it's not very friendly. It can be overly wet, it can be overly long, it can be worn out. I would rather see, rather than large grass areas, I would rather see small grass areas broken up by walking paths and benches that told me I was invited to go out into that green field, rather than a sprinkler that went off overnight and left the grass wet the next day all month long in June gloom, and I'm obviously not going to sit on it. So I would hope that you would look for other ways to comply with the spirit of that original direction and encourage the public use of both the Paseo in Area B and the Plaza area in Area C. I also think that the downtown shuttle's getting a short shift here. Part of the considerations also in the original determination was a myriad of approvals on the Coastal Act, the local coastal plan, a development plan, God knows what else, that all talk about access to transit, encouraging access to transit, encouraging somebody to park and take the transit, and going from what has been a traditional and quote-unquote historical location of a shuttle with a covered and obvious location to what will seemingly just be a pole on the street in a right-hand turn lane doesn't accomplish that for me. I would go so far as even to say that meeting the intent of those considerations at that time would be to move the shuttle over in front of the Visitor Information Center. And you could, in my little planning mind, you could do that simply by counting 4 trees there and then bringing the curb back in instead of having a landscaping area there, and make a shuttle turn out there, which would be right in front of the Visitor Information Center. And I think you should work somehow either to replicate or mimic the existing bench and covering and enclosure that's there. Allison, I looked, I've got a reference to it on page 80, but I can't find page 80 because I've got 700 pages on my iPad. But it was in all 3 sections, A, B, and C, and it referenced lighted and covered bus and transit facilities. And in this particular case, I think it's really important. The farther people are moved away from the freeway underpass to look to go sit on a shuttle and convince them to go under the freeway is more difficult. And I say that with 5 years of sitting as a host down at hotspots, trying to point people past that freeway because they just don't get it. And so having it outside a visitor information center and closer to that area, I think accomplishes the original intent. On Area B, I also agree, I think, with Commissioner Peugeot's comments that a paseo does not narrow down to a 3 or 5 foot e-ticket line at Disneyland shuttle line to get back out the other end of the shuttle, out the other end of the paseo. I would neither like to see a loading zone or a storage zone at the end of that paseo. I would like to see that paseo be a pedestrian paseo that maintains that width all the way through to Helena Street. And I'd also like to go so far as to suggest that the improvements that you're showing in the elevation on State Street actually don't bring me in or encourage me to go by the fountain and the steps. I would suggest that needs to be more open. Maybe you want to, if you're intent on having those type of improvements in the area, that you move those into the block more so that it's obvious to me that there's not a barrier, steps, some planters, and a fountain there, that there's not a visual barrier keeping me from making that connection, that there's something right there behind it that's as open and inviting as there is through the rest of the paseo, but I never got that far. Finally, my last point on just the conformity issue is I'm extremely uncomfortable with the front of the lobby on Mason Street and the proposal to have queuing up there for vehicles going to valet parking. I share the same concern Commissioner Peugeot did about the level of activity basically at checkout time on a Sunday afternoon of a busy weekend, clogging up that entire sidewalk with baggage and baggage carts and people waiting for their cars. So they'd probably be waiting for their cars on the other side of the street. But I just think that brings up until this time, a unknown amount of activity to a public right-of-way that doesn't exist anywhere else in town where you can make that comparison and say it will work or it won't work. So I don't have an answer for that. I'm going to trust Mr. Armstrong and city transportation staff to figure out how they're going to do that. But I think you basically are going to close off those two sides of the street at different times, check in and check out, to the pedestrian experience and what's going on, and also just essentially shut down the vehicle access if I want to come up and drive up State Street and turn right and go to the public parking lot, if I don't know that I can get there through Helena or I don't know that I can get there through Anacapa. And then just some thoughts on having nothing really to do with conformance. I actually drove down there the other day again and looked, but we have a new public parking lot associated with the soon-to-be open youth hostel, and there's, of course, not a parking sign anywhere around alerting you to the fact that parking's over there. You know, with the little arrow, you can drive any direction you want to, and there's no parking sign. So I'm really concerned, again, that the knowledge of a public parking lot as a driver will be so hidden that it doesn't accomplish its purpose or the consideration that was given it. And I'd just like to see staff make sure that as it goes through the process, that they have a plan for bringing that lot to the attention of locals or guests. I also think it's equally important to not make me walk around a whole block to get back to my car from wherever I am, and that those methods that you're going to tell people how to get back to their car, if they go out one way, then go down to the wharf and then come back, that they don't have to walk another block, that there's an easy method to find out that there's another way to get to that parking lot. And then, I know it's not up for discussion, and we've been admonished, but I will join Mr. Thompson in mentioning my displeasure on the situation on narrowing State Street. I think there's that the 12 years ago, that determination was made, and that particular area looked a lot different. I'm happy that it's coming up with council. I'll be happy to go speak in front of council, but I think we're moving again into unintended consequences. We're going to force tons of traffic down Helena and Anacapa. We're going to force people to try and get out onto State Street against traffic on Helena and Anacapa or Chapala, and none of those streets seem capable of doing it. I'm a little frustrated at the fact that they can't be opened up to talk about, and it's nothing on the project, has nothing to do. I understand you're just a person that's got to do what they say you're going to do in this particular case, but I think some of the gains that are being made there when that plaza design concept has been married up with this project, but this project still had to get past considerations and findings for Coastal Act and local coastal plan, and clearly just cherry picking stuff out of there. There are considerations in both of those that say the changes will never negatively affect traffic circulation. And certainly this is going to affect traffic circulation, this narrowing of the street. So I'm very uncomfortable with that, and I thank you for giving me the indulgence to say something about it. So any other comments? Okay. So I think generally that's a positive stamp. I'm sorry to be the only one who insists on holding my comments hostage to the conformance. I will be there with bells and whistles the day this project opens, congratulating you, and I look forward to having that happen as soon as possible. Okay, you're welcome. So we'll take a 10 or 15-minute break before our next item. So let's say no later than 4:05 for Ms. Zachary from Parks and Recs.
Someone will come.
When the next disaster strikes, will you know what to do?
Dad, I know what to do. I learned it at school. Come on.
Take the first step.
Wait!
Oh, kid, it's dangerous.
Being prepared is easier than you think.
I can't watch.
Send help.
Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order, and give me a moment. I'll get to the right page, because I don't want to misstate the title. But our next item is, quickly, a review and presentation by Ms. Zachary on the Urban Forest Management Plan, or something there close. I'll let you correct me. So, Ms. Zachary, welcome.
Chair Jordan and members of the Planning Commission, Jill Zachary, I'm the Assistant Director of Parks and Recreation. And for this item on your agenda, we're here to ask for your comments and feedback on our project and present you as well some of our preliminary results, and then sort of tell you where we're going from here. The Parks and Recreation Department began developing an urban forest management plan in July, so this fiscal year. We have a number of tasks that we've been busy working on for the last 8 months, including doing a baseline analysis, forming a technical advisory committee, doing a tree canopy assessment, basically rounding up all city policy rules, everything we know and involve trees, and essentially setting the framework to move forward with developing the plan. The purpose of the plan, as you can imagine, is to develop a long-range approach to managing the city's urban forest, both the public urban forest, so the city trees, trees in city parks, and trees on city public properties, and then the urban forest as a whole. If you consider the entire city and you look out and you see an urban forest, a good portion of that's not on city-owned land, but does comprise the urban forest for Santa Barbara. So with today's presentation, what I would like to do is present our tree canopy results very briefly, some results from community meetings and a community tree survey that we completed, present some of our key issues, and then preliminary draft objectives and key actions, and ask for your comments, particularly focused on key issues, and then certainly any responses you might have on our draft objectives. We are going to boards and commissions for the month of April, so this is part of a large effort to gather as much input at this point in the project. Keep going over here. There we go. Before I start, I would like to share with you two things that were developed in conjunction with our Technical Advisory Committee, which does include representative from the Planning Commission, Chair Jordan, Parks and Recreation Commission, Street Tree Advisory Committee, and then Southern California Edison, and members from the public such as Santa Barbara Beautiful and other experts. So one of the first things we did is come up with a vision. What's our vision for the urban forest? So what do we want it to be in 30 to 50 years? And really what we want is healthy and diverse, something that continues to contribute to our economic and environmental and aesthetic vitality, and is cared and valued by the city and its citizens, and also reflects our horticultural heritage. Santa Barbara has a fairly incredible horticultural heritage when it comes to trees and plants. And actually, we most recently learned from one of our advisory committee members that we still have the most diverse tree population in all of Southern California, which is over 450 different trees found on city property. So again, that doesn't necessarily that's just city property that we're talking about. We also spend some time looking at what's our mission. Really, what is the mission of this effort? In a sense, this helps guide us in our efforts, gives us a sense of what we want to achieve and why we're doing what we're doing. And essentially, it's very similar to what we consider our mission today: preserve and protect and enhance trees, promote the benefits of trees, and foster a healthy and diverse urban forest. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that one of the first steps we took was to do a baseline tree canopy assessment. Back in 2007, we did a street tree inventory. We did a park tree inventory. We also did some follow-up canopy assessment in our open space parks to get a handle of what does the city have in terms of tree resources, and what's the state of those tree resources. But we didn't really have a sense of really what's the sense of the trees for the urban forest as a whole. The benefit of doing a canopy assessment is you get that snapshot. It's something that many cities do as a baseline approach to looking at planning for the urban forest. It gives you something to measure against. And in some cases, it's given other communities a way to benchmark their progress and their successes. Whether that's something we proceed with is not something that we've currently developed a recommendation about, but it does give us a place to start. So for Santa Barbara, we determined and we essentially digitized all the canopy cover for the entire city. And that was a 300-hour staff effort in front of a computer, drawing canopy, and through a series of assumptions and using different imagery data and coming up with basically what we thought. And we cross-checked it using other methods. So we feel fairly confident that what we're saying is pretty good. It's pretty good information. So citywide, we are saying our canopy cover is about 25%. So 25% of the city has some amount of tree canopy covering it, anywhere in the city. When you look at how that breaks down to the percent of canopy cover you might find in residential areas, almost 28%. So residential areas have a higher canopy coverage than, for example, parks and open space. If you look at all of our parks and open space, they're covered by about 23% of tree canopy. Commercial and civic areas, 20%. Office areas, 11%. That's not surprising. Industrial, public schools are different amounts. When you look in the staff report that was provided to you, it actually breaks it down a little bit more in terms of residential areas, for example, contribute to 80% of the total canopy of the city. If you imagine that, that's because most of our land area is largely devoted, most of it's devoted to residential areas. So you'll find that change over time. When you look at different neighborhoods, there's a low of 4 to 7% and a high of 51%. So if you think of more urban neighborhoods, such as the Lower East Side, and then you think of the Riviera area, which is still urbanized, but there's a lot more tree coverage, there's fewer streets, larger lots, there's higher percent canopy. We find the same thing in our park and open spaces. The beach parks, not a lot of canopy. It's not surprising. You go into our open space parks, they're more. Surprisingly, we found many of our neighborhood parks have the highest canopy cover. And in some cases, those may be some of our oldest parks as well. As part of our outreach and public sort of information efforts for this project, we're planning a series of 3 different community meetings, a kickoff meeting, and we did that in January, a follow-up in June, and then sometime in the fall as we move through the process. One of our objectives with these community meetings is sort of say, this is what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then also use the opportunity to talk about the city's trees and the city's urban forest and our forestry program and our tree preservation policies, and then ask a series of questions of the people that participated in those meetings. And we really wanted to see what their vision was when we were talking about an urban forest. We also wanted to know what tree issues were important to them, what they thought the city should prioritize when it came to the urban forest and trees, and then what they thought citizens, residents, might be able to do to preserve trees and care for our urban forest. What we heard, a broad range of things, but I think what we heard loud and clear, we had 2 meetings, same structure, just on different days to try to increase the participation in the meetings, is increased city tree maintenance, really focused on street trees. A lot of people do get focused on the street trees because they look at them outside their house every day. Need for larger canopy trees. We presented in our workshops that we have almost 8,000 empty city tree wells. So that generated a response, we'll plant some more trees. That's a complicated thing to address, as you can imagine. Other suggestions, partnerships, both with schools and also other agencies. A desire for more information. One of the things that Parks and Recreation does mostly is maintain trees. We're operations. It's operations. Parks is an operations division. We've never really spent a lot of time doing the kind of education and outreach that you might find in a different city department. Residents' interest in planting and caring for trees, and interest in residents to report problems that they see. As part of that work effort, we also distributed a survey at the workshops. We had about 25 or 30 surveys that we got from the workshops, and we thought, boy, we really need to broaden this. So we put the survey on SurveyMonkey and sent it out, and we ended up with over 500 responses, and essentially asking the same questions. What's most important to you? What are city priorities? What do you think residents can do? And over again, aesthetics, maintenance, tree health, protection. We did hear more about historic and specimen trees through the online survey responses than we heard in the workshops. Again, city priorities, tree planting, public safety, maintenance. Again, resident contribution, better understanding city policies, reporting problems. Essentially, it gave us a, kind of a snapshot of what people are thinking. We did ask whether they'd contacted the city about trees, and it was about half and half, which was kind of interesting. I would add that the recipients of this email was from the city's e-subscriptions list, so it's a group of people that are more likely to be engaged in city organization or city government. But that was the best way we could try to sort of generate some information. Familiarity with tree preservation policies, considering the level of knowledge probably of many of these recipients, we were a little surprised that only 9% said they were very familiar, 47% they were somewhat familiar, and 44% unfamiliar. So that, again, sort of reminded us maybe part of what we should be doing is more education and outreach, and how do we spend the time on that level. And then to get to questions and comments that we would like from the Commission, one of the work efforts that we developed with our Technical Advisory Committee and working with city staff, so departmental staff, community development, public works, fire, parks and recreation, and then through the community and meetings and survey, is what are the key issues that we really should be looking at for the management plan. We can't solve everything. It's not going to solve everything, but it is our blueprint for moving forward. And this is what we're seeking input from you today. And I'm going to briefly, your staff report really provides, your second attachment is a detailed table that we've identified. But essentially, the issues focus around tree resources. What should we be doing related just for diversity, health, sustaining tree resources? How does that differ between city publicly owned trees versus private trees? And when we reference private trees, we're really talking about trees that are currently regulated by municipal ordinance. So if they're in the front yard setback, if they're part of an approved landscape plan, and then there are other policies and suggestions in the general plan, recent general plan, about how we look at preserving natives. So there's some other aspects about that. From a policy and planning standpoint, really looking at our street tree master plan, 1977. It was a little while ago. Maybe it's time to update that. We don't have a park tree master plan. We have suggested actions in our other planning documents in the city, moving forward with those and using this as an opportunity to articulate in more detail how we might do that. Program funding, nothing new for anyone involved in city organization. The forestry program's been reduced over the years, just like many other programs. And as a result, we've had to reduce the kind of maintenance that we provide and not been able to advocate for education and outreach efforts to the extent we might be able to do in the future. And then city organization, of course, there's always ways to look at how we can communicate and coordinate better, and community involvement. I'm just going to keep going through my slides and go through the objectives, if that's okay with the Commission. Great. So one of the things we started to do, just as a way to help our advisory committee and us sort of say, okay, well, these are the issues, so how do we turn that into what we put in the plan that we're actually going to do about these issues? Certainly would appreciate your feedback as well. It's not complete. It's not like our first draft. It's just a way to begin the dialogue. And similarly, we've organized them under 4 categories: tree resources, city, policy and planning, and community involvement. And sort of the key issues are sort of maintain, sustain, maximize, funding, communication, planning, awareness, incentives, participation. Under tree resources, some of the issues that have been come up is how do we provide sustainable tree canopy? How do we maximize it as we look across the city? Where do we maximize it? Age and species diversity. And then looking at how do we also maximize the benefits of the urban forest? Color, aesthetics, shade, environmental, while also balancing some of the constraints in an urban environment when it comes to trees. Under city organization, funding, communication, coordination, partnerships, we've come up with recommendations. Maybe we should have an annual training. Maybe we should emulate the land development team and have a tree resource internal team so that when there is a project under development review, trees become part of the front end rather than what we do at the end when we're sort of getting to, oh yeah, let's talk about trees now. Under policy and planning, as I mentioned, taking some of our other planning efforts one step forward. Can the urban forest management plan play a role in that while still remaining consistent with all of those planning documents? And then tree preservation ordinances, that's an ongoing discussion at the commission, council, street tree advisory committee, all the boards and commissions. Where do we fall with preserving trees? The city has many, many decades of valuing the preservation of private trees and public trees. Is there any reason why that might change or over time? And then community involvement. I think one of the things we just keep coming back to is how do we broaden public participation? How do we make the connection for many people that the tree in front of their house is their resource, the community resource, and a city resource? And then the trees on their property are their resources, but also contribute to the health and vitality of the larger community. And what role can the city play in fostering that kind of thing? So, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're sort of coming to boards and commissions and sort of saying, this is where we are, we'd like your input. We are going to be developing draft goals and objectives and working on that April, May, June. And then we actually like to go back out and have some more public meetings. And then we'll be going to council, we anticipate in July, sort of once all the budget hearing process is over. They're well aware we're working on this effort, and we feel that that would be a good opportunity to give them a status report. That, I conclude my remarks and be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Questions and comments for one or the other? Ms. Peugeot.
I have a couple of questions, especially because I'm fairly new to the commission. Could you just briefly describe basically the genesis of the project? Was it related to out-of-date master plans, to the new general plan? How did it get on your work program, for example?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Peugeot, that's a great question, and I've sort of skipped over all the history of it. But for the past probably 6 or 7 years, we've been taking a really hard look at our forestry program, and every year implementing a different level of effort. Number one, doing an inventory of our existing trees. We hadn't done one in over 10 years. We didn't really know what the state of our public urban forest was, so we took care of that in 2007. We then wanted to sort of, as we've sort of moved forward in terms of responding to sort of the financial crisis the community was in and having to refine the way we do business, look at increasing community concerns and issues about trees, whether it had to do with infrastructure constraints, whether it had to do with working with Southern California Edison and the fact that we have these mature trees that are now growing into power lines and do end up being trimmed in a way that isn't aesthetically pleasing. Knowing that we have major commercial corridors such as Upper State Street, where we have trees that have absolutely outgrown their planter space. We also have a concerned community in terms of what happens next. And the tools we had on hand to try to begin addressing that is sort of catch as catch can, reactive. And we determined, looking at our street tree master plan, wow, this was good in the 70s, and yeah, we can look at it, but it doesn't really help us plan for the future. And then lastly, sometimes trees are an afterthought. Even though they're so prominently important to many people, we find that we're playing catch-up often. This is the way we felt like we could move it forward and have both a blueprint for what we do on a day-to-day basis plus the vision for where we want to end up. And then lastly, I would just add, we also got grant funding for it, and that's the only reason why we're doing it.
As a follow-up to that, so the end result will be this management plan or new master plan, and is that something that you get input on, put a cover on, and it becomes it, or is there another process to it?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Pujo, we anticipate, from the department's perspective, we anticipate that this is something that would get updated periodically, would be what we would report, benchmark on an annual or semi-annual basis in terms of moving forward with kind of what our department's responsible for in terms of managing trees. We will be going to council and asking them to adopt it by resolution, so it'll get referenced in Chapter 1520 and 1524 and any other relevant municipal code, and it would replace the street tree master plan, for example.
All right, thank you. And just a really quick question. You used to have a position of a city arborist, and Dan Condon is the last one I remember that used to be on that. Do you still have that position, or how is that handled?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Pujo, we have a city arborist. The official title is Urban Forest Superintendent. But that is one area where we sort of collapsed a program a little bit. So we have a street tree inspector and an urban forest superintendent. And we have a crew of 4 field staff that trim trees and 2 that do young trees.
And I did have one last question. It's on your report. So there's something around 25% tree canopy cover, something like that. But I didn't see anything that did any sort of comparative analysis from it. Is that more than most cities our size, less?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Pujo, actually, we're doing pretty well relative. I think the average, there have been a number of different surveys done. One that we recently looked at, out of 60 cities that were surveyed, the average canopy was around 23%. In some cases, we're lower than cities such as Washington, D.C. or Baltimore. No surprises there. But we're also higher than other cities, if I recall correctly, Seattle, for example. In part, Seattle's challenge was when they redeveloped their downtown, they basically eliminated all their trees. So they have a large downtown area that is virtually treeless, but they also have lots of tall buildings, and it's a different place. So from that standpoint, we're doing okay. I would say a number of these cities use canopy cover as a benchmark, but it's really difficult to figure out how you get there. Because we spent some time trying to figure out, well, if you took a tree and you averaged its canopy, how many trees would you have to plant to increase your canopy cover by 2%, knowing that you're actually also losing trees at the same time? And it's a challenging way to go.
Okay. Those are my questions. I'll have a couple comments later, but those are my questions. Thank you.
I think we need some pepping up here. Talk about trees. Ms. Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You said it's not surprising that Washington, D.C. and Baltimore have more. It is surprising to me, particularly thinking of Baltimore. Do you know enough about either one of them to be able to tell why?
I say that primarily because I'm familiar with both cities, and they have very large canopy trees and a much wetter environment than we do. And large open spaces, particularly in the case of Washington, D.C., the Potomac River region, that my assumption is when I think of a canopied area, I think of the Northeast of having a far greater canopy cover than Southern California, in terms of also the type of species of trees that they can support, just because of the climate. It's colder, but it's also much wetter.
Mr. Bartlett?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Zachary, can you clarify a little bit? I was looking at the chart where you calculated all the percentages of tree coverage, and it does say that you've taken out, obviously, the unincorporated areas of the county and the freeway, but I'm assuming for the base area that you did your comparison on, that you kept all the street widths and all that within the area of the city? You didn't discount that?
Yes, Commissioner Jordan, Chair Jordan and Commissioner Bartlett, we did keep all the streets. So what you don't have here, and there's a whole separate tree canopy report, so we could have given you attachments that made up a binder about this thick, is that included in these areas are the streets.
Okay.
But we have pulled out street coverage as a separate in another. I don't have that information right here, if we just looked at what city streets.
But it is included in this base ratio that you've come up with then?
Yes.
Okay. And then you'd made a comment during your presentation, and I'm hoping I heard this right. You said there were 8,000 empty city tree wells?
That's correct.
Seems like an awful lot.
Yes, and again, the priority of the city for many years has been on maintaining existing trees. We once had a goal to plant 300 trees a year. It's now down to 150 as a result of our budget reductions. We lose about 150 a year. So in some instances, it's in decline. In some instances, and this is where a revised street tree master plan would come into play, we may not want to plant all 8,000 because they could have been designed into a sidewalk scheme that's no longer appropriate. So part of it is trying to, okay, of those 8,000, really what are we talking about? It might be 6, it might be 7. But yes, there are a number of empty spaces.
Of those 8,000, were most of them planted at one time, or they were put in and never had trees planted there?
I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that question right now. That would require additional work.
And then in the report, it said that there was an important linkage between this and the pedestrian master plan, and I would certainly hope as it goes forward that those two try and converge so they're not competing elements. Okay.
Of course, there'll be isn't it worth the price of admission today, just knowing there's 8,000 empty tree wells around here? I walked around for a month and told everybody I knew, but, and of course you can keep that concern going to the general plan and increase densities and building out the lot lines, and can a tree grow in a pot versus does it need to be in the ground, and how does that all figure in? And so it just gets worse and worse. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Zachary, on the 8,000 empty tree wells, could you clarify for me if we're going to, as part of the master planning process, evaluate which ones warrant a tree replacement or tree planting, perhaps even for the first time? As you've said, we're not sure if all 8,000 ever actually had trees planted in them. Mm-hmm.
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Schwartz, and back to Commissioner Bartlett's original question too, one of the things we would do as part of updating the street tree master plan is take our inventory one step further and look at those empty areas, determine what could be planted there, and then right now our street tree master plan just designates species by street. And we go in and we can there is a redesignation process, but we would use that as a way to say if a tree well is 3 feet by 3 feet, it can have a tree up to this height. If it's this, it can have up to this height. And then we take it one step further if possible. And this is, again, the plan wouldn't do this work, but the update to the street tree master plan would, that process would do it, is where can we find places to plant the largest trees, and where can we find places to change the tree well size to accommodate a different tree. So all of those things would factor in. And then what is the species that would be appropriate in that consideration?
And so species would not only be height, but it would also be root system, because part of our current challenge, right, is for those mature trees in particular, where the root system is pushing up sidewalks out into our street, roadways, et cetera, we have some real issues throughout the city with that.
Yes, it would. It would certainly, when it comes to street trees, there are a number of trees that would be on a "Don't Plant Again" list.
Never again.
Unless the parkway is large enough to support it. And in some cases, there are streets in Santa Barbara where there are large parkways, and where, if feasible, we would support larger trees. And from just to continue on from the sort of city department perspective, it would seem appropriate that we would prioritize the city's work effort on public streets and in parks in terms of increasing canopy and planting trees. So that would probably be one of our higher priorities in the planning process.
Regarding, so once the evaluation takes place of the 8,000 and we determine how many really warrant either a tree being planted for the first time or replanted, do you intend, or is it your thought at this point, the department's thought, of working with any nonprofits that do this sort of thing? We've seen this, I've seen this in other cities where there's these type of very cost-effective collaborations with nonprofits who do plant city trees in neighborhoods.
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Schwartz, we currently work with Santa Barbara Beautiful.
Right.
They pay for every tree that's planted. So they cover the cost. We go pick up the trees. We plant the tree, and then we care for the tree.
Okay.
When you think about planting a tree, it's not just planting it. It has to be cared for. And that's our challenge, is the amount of care a tree might require for the first 3 to 5 years is currently a limiting factor. So one of the concepts we would like to pursue is how do we increase neighborhood participation in caring for street trees? And how do we work with residents to have them help care for the trees, at least provide supplemental care for the trees? So that's something we would be very interested in pursuing from that standpoint. In order to be successful, we would need to take that approach.
Thank you.
Mr. Campanella?
Thank you, Chair Jordan. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. A couple of questions I had was maybe non-traditional approaches to getting trees in my mind anyway. Maybe folks have studied it. Let's say a number of the areas in town have, because of our large blocks, have alleyways with additional second units, third units, whatever, which if you could get access, I think, rather than on the public street, if people could have an idea to plant trees that could separate the building, where the buildings are currently sited, to provide some degree of privacy and shading, et cetera. I wondered if you ever looked at that, where that might be conducive for people participating, not so much in the parkways, but where it can do more benefit, where you have house-to-house abutting situations.
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Campanella, we have talked about, and it has been suggested in different ways, how we might develop programs that would provide incentives for private tree planting, and how we would encourage private tree planting. That's certainly something we would explore if there's community support to go in that direction. We actually, as part of our work effort up to this date, did produce a community guide to tree planting, which we make available, to help people pick the right tree and put it in the right place. So we minimize some of the challenges that people end up with, where they planted a tree right next to their house, or in a place where once it's grown, they realize wasn't such a good idea, or when they picked it up at the nursery, they didn't see its mature height was such and such. We would think that would be a very good approach to working to enhance private tree canopy, definitely.
Second question, if I can. It was probably 2 years ago at this time. I went down to Houston. First time I've been there. They had the basketball NCAA Final Four. And flying out, I was surprised. Houston, I thought, it's South Texas. But there was tree canopy all over the place in the city of Houston, which surprised me. I didn't think that's the way I would see it. And that was all types of areas that they had that set up. And then flying into Santa Barbara, of course, if you look at the industrial or commercial manufacturing zones, there's nothing really there. So I didn't know if there was any effort that could be done to areas that really have all that non-shading and heat gain, maybe where you can start from scratch and try to design in, say setting the stage for redevelopment, if you will, a little bit, by hardscape and trees and tree wells, even though right now it's not mixed use, like in the CM zone or the commercial zones, that eventually it might get there, but maybe some encouragement to what that street scene can look like for residents, just like the various planting areas that you put around town make it acceptable. I don't know if you looked at those areas at all for enhancement.
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Campanella, we haven't looked specifically, for example, at those areas in Santa Barbara. It has come up, and Chair Jordan brought it up, where one of the objectives of our management plan could be to pick areas of the city that were high priority for doing advanced planning related to how the streetscape would change, what kind of trees might be planted. So when the area redevelops, and our focus was and it has initially been more just looking at major corridors in Santa Barbara, Upper State Street, Milpas, Carrillo, where we have these mature canopy trees that aren't going to live forever. But then we do have areas that you are correct. We have very few trees, and how might we enhance that canopy? And certainly that's something we could build into looking at as part of the plan.
That's what's been, well, you know this, it's been particularly attractive about participating in this process to me is that we essentially have an opportunity, once you become educated, you have an opportunity to the bite of this out of the apple. But right now, it's just a back page or two on a set of plans, the landscaping plan, which is going to another design board, and what are they looking at? And they're typically, I would hazard, looking at site-specific design issues rather than big picture. You know, is that a particular area in town that's deficient in trees? Is it close to the freeway and it needs a better environmental type of mitigator tree rather than a palm tree? Is it an area that's going to be inclined to produce higher density housing right out to the property line? And how are we going to take a bite of that apple and make sure that they still don't erode away the canopy or the tree presence? So there's a lot of education there. I'm happy to see that all those points are still on there about getting out the boards and commissions. I endorse when you move this project forward that it's almost like a mandatory training for other boards and commissions who have a bite at that apple but don't have a landscape architect as a mandate sitting right next to them and want to look at the bigger picture. I had a couple more points just want to talk about. Other things we talked about too is being able to have there's actually already some type of grading system, but actually enhancing that to almost like a grading system matrix so you could easily go through a sheet, and when you have a set of parameters you're looking for, environmental, space, skinny, wide, whatever it is, and you need to match it up, you just kind of follow the matrix and you pick a tree or a selection of tree, and you know why you did it. You know, what you didn't mention is one of the things that people have laughed about too is it's a great tree, but one time a year it's got droppings all over the sidewalk and everybody hates it for that period of 2 months. But if you went out there and tried to take care of that with a chainsaw, people would be up in arms. So I think it's been a very educational process, and like anything else, it's long and costly and bureaucratic, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to be a great end product. And the worry, of course, is that you won't know what you've lost until it's too late. You know, if we're losing 1% net every year in 20 years, well, despite replacing trees, we'll look up in 20 years and we just lost 20% of our trees, and weren't even proactively taking steps to avoid that. So, are these new lights, Mr. Bartlett? Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So going back to the percentage of tree coverage, on average, you're saying it's 25%. In the areas of the city that you feel are more desirable, what does that percentage look like? And what would be the goal if there was a magic percentage we were hoping to hit at some point in the future?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Bartlett, I don't know that I would say that there would be a goal. Some of the things we've discussed at the Technical Advisory Committee and among staff are the prioritization of areas with less tree coverage over those with more, and looking at the potential for parks and public open spaces to provide additional canopy. In some cases, it may not be appropriate to increase the tree canopy. At the beach, that's a really tough environment to try to get trees to grow. There's a reason why they're not there. In the Riviera areas, there's also the consideration for wildland fire. So part of it is that sort of balancing act of how we do that. So from a neighborhood standpoint, certainly areas that have, if we were to look at wanting 25% in all residential areas. That could be one way to sort of do an analysis and say, well, what would it take to get there if the city planted the trees? Which we may not be able to get to that if the city just planted the trees.
Well, I know in a lot of the project reviews that we've done over the years, many projects end up with off-site mitigation requirements. Do you have a list of opportunity sites that you would place trees in when projects come along that are required to do off-site mitigation, where we could link, providing trees with a specific project to be used elsewhere?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Bartlett, we do not, and however, we have been asked on a number of occasions to absorb mitigation in city parks. That is a challenging thing to take into consideration if you don't have a way to maintain the trees. That said, if it was a program we were to try to define, we would have to define into what the success of that mitigation measure was in terms of, the tree can now function largely under the city's maintenance practices within 5 years of being planted. We just haven't done the work to do that, but we could certainly evaluate that as.
And what is the standard for tree maintenance? I know, at least in the neighborhood where my office is, we put in new trees with the renovation of our office. We have irrigation system in the parkway, and yet the city comes by every week with their big watering truck. They fill it up at the fire hydrant and wash the whole area with water, even though it's fully irrigated. Do they typically drive through every neighborhood and water all the parkways? I mean, is that a standard?
Chair Jordan and Commissioner Bartlett, I couldn't tell you exactly what the schedule is. I'd be happy to find that out more in detail. Our standard is that we are to provide both watering and trimming care for the first 3 years. Depending on the species of tree, it varies. And we should be taking into consideration if there's existing irrigation, and as well as the type of watering that should occur, whether it's a deep watering once every 3 months or whatever it might be. That's something I could provide more information to you. But we have one individual that waters trees for the city and parkways, and then we have one individual who goes around and actually does the hand pruning, the small tree pruning work that we do. And we actually dedicate a lot of resources, if you think about it, to that very thing compared to, our budget's about $1.2 million, and we have about $900,000 for city trees, $950,000 for, 35,000 trees.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Zachary, you asked for feedback, so just a few thoughts. First, I want to express my compliments to you and the department and everybody involved in this, because I think this is such an important undertaking. It's very timely. We're an old city, a mature city with mature landscaping or tree and tree canopy. And I think that, I don't know what percentage of the mature trees we have now, especially in the public right-of-way, that were desirable from an aesthetic perspective when they were planted, or they were in vogue when they were planted, but there wasn't an understanding of, perhaps, or consideration given to the life cycle impacts to a city and a city's infrastructure and all of that. So I know this is resource intensive, the type of undertaking, human resource intensive, but I think it's so important because I think we're going to come out of it an enlightened city in understanding not only what we have on the ground now, but the best way to move forward. Removal, replanting, maintenance, where we should be putting our resources. To that end, I think it's going to be a challenge for us to balance our priorities between what we maintain in the mature areas of our community and the mature trees, and then areas where we don't have sufficient trees today. And we've just finished the review of La Entrada, and that's adjacent to the Funk Zone, which some of us think, could use some more attention. I think will be getting the attention it needs as projects come online, so that we can even out throughout our city a strategic planning effort that looks at where we should have what types of trees, known as Tree City USA. I guess we're still known as that, aren't we? So on the one hand, that sounds great. It's very challenging to maintain at all levels. So I think as creatively as you're going to be working with nonprofits and so forth is probably the financially feasible way to go. I'm not sure everybody appreciates, but perhaps the public will increasingly appreciate the environmental benefit. So there's the visual, aesthetically appealing benefit, but we also have hard scientific evidence as to the air quality benefits of course, the right types of trees being planted in a community and being maintained in a community. And I think an environmentally sensitive community as we are, I think there'll be greater appreciation for that as you reach out to the public and you educate the public and get feedback from the public. So this is very exciting to me. And again, I greatly appreciate everything you're doing and look forward to the process moving forward. Thank you so much.
Ms. Peugeot.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few comments. My comments are in two categories. One is some of the issues that you bring up, and the other goes kind of back to the process and the end product, the development of the plan. So I'll start with the issues, and then looking at what I've jotted down, what keeps coming to the top of my list is education and promotion, which you have mentioned. It's a big topic. I think it should be a really strong component of your overall master plan and program from a couple of different perspectives. One is, I understand that there's been the community input in the workshops, and I think that is great. I believe that gaining the neighborhood involvement, not necessarily on a neighborhood-by-neighborhood basis, but some sort of neighbor input, and also a focus group input. What you mentioned already, Santa Barbara, beautiful, but there are lots of other groups that are already educated or could help educate as to the proper care and maintenance of a tree, proper pruning of a tree, species compatibility with the location and whatnot. And I think that those groups would be probably more than happy to continue or increase their involvement in this kind of a project. And I also want to add on there that education for work crews is also very important. And I appreciate that you're coordinating with SCE, but some of the saddest events I see are tree topping just for expediency, unskilled crews trying to prune a mature tree. And those kinds of things, I think, would go a long ways to our tree health in our community, and also would help educate us all, which I think would be great. Maybe something that's like the do's and the don'ts that everybody could take a look at, you know, for the trees in their garden and trees in the street. That would be my number one. And then after that, sustainability came up in your survey, and I also agree with Commissioner Schwartz that the environmental aspects of it are very important. The sustainability and climate change benefits of having a healthy tree population in a community. Although some of the other items ranked maybe 1 or 2, I think it should be acknowledged that the sustainability ranking was still something like 40% of the overall surveyed group that turned in their surveys, which isn't that much different from those that mentioned views as an important topic. And we know how important views and trees has become and been addressed in the city in the past. So I think sustainability is an important item that should be focused on. I just want to say on a couple of small things, I really appreciate Commissioner Campanella's comment about the alleyways, because we do have a system of paseos and alleyways, and where I live backs up on one of these older alleys, and I think it's a fantastic idea and should be explored about ways that neighbors could do small things. Even if you plant a tree that will grow to maturity at your property line, not even on the city line, but the canopy starts to shade over the alley. It's a major improvement. And that brings me to my last item in terms of an issue area that I didn't see addressed too strongly in here, but I don't think should be underestimated, and that's the shade benefits of trees, both on pedestrians and also on the actual street or alleyway. I think that should be elevated in importance in your plan personally. So those are my comments on the issue areas, and then on the plan document and its evolution itself, a couple of things. First of all, I think it would be helpful, even though it might be a short list, to have some sort of glossary. Like, my first question was, what exactly is an urban forest? And I think we need to understand that. And you say trees, but does that mean some vegetation that is sometimes a tree, sometimes a not? I mean, what are we really talking about? And I didn't see, for example, any discussion of skyline trees, which to me is slightly different than mature trees or specimen trees or historic trees, but are in and of themselves some of the things that guide you when you're traveling through the city about, oh yeah, well, you can walk 2 blocks over there, you can see where that huge pine is, that's where we're going, you know, and they're landmarks of a certain different type. So I think some sort of definitions would be helpful. And then in terms of your objectives and goals, I would just suggest 2 things. Actually, one, really. I think the main thing for me is I think that every item in there should have some consideration of what will constitute success and what about it could be measurable so we can determine how we're doing. So those would be my comments. Thanks.
Any other comments? Ms. Lodge?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with many of the, I guess all of the comments that have been made. And I think, and congratulations on having gotten a grant to do the study and to be able to move forward on this. And I assume you are looking for other grants. It's one of the things, just getting down to tree species, one of the things that perhaps makes our tree canopy a little less than it might be is the number of palm trees that we have. And perhaps there should be some consideration of moving away from them because they don't provide much in the way of shade or really impact except more from a distance. And perhaps seeing if we can develop some more ideas about what are the best kinds of trees for street trees, or what we can get the public to encourage them to plant. I've said this before. I think people just don't understand how important Santa Barbara's trees are to the community. And that would tie in with the education part. But if you try to imagine Santa Barbara without trees, well, and Father Sarah said way back when he described Santa Barbara as being on the mission was being established on a dismal, treeless plain. And a lot has been done to change it. And we've got to make sure that we keep going in that direction. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ms. Zachary. I'll see you at the next meeting. And I think you've gotten some good input here. I encourage you to come back. And just also wanted to say, I know that's we get a room of about, 20 people who are all got their own little idea what a tree is or what a tree should do. And it's kind of a fun little project. But I just also wanted to mention also that I've been very appreciative and encouraged to work with the city arborist, Tim Downey, in that environment too. I find that he brings a lot to the room in terms of keeping it to the city of Santa Barbara and keeping us on track. And he's got a level head that I think is pushing us in the right direction. So be happy if you'd pass that along. Okay, next item would be our administrative agenda and committee and liaison reports, and we'll start with the staff hearing officer report.
The staff hearing officer had a whole list of existing houses that were built before the rules got changed and needed to have modifications, and they were almost all quite minor. One of them involved view setbacks and a little laundry room that had been built on this tiny lot that, of course, had an even tinier house on it. And so she did call for some reduction in a wall height so that views along from an alleyway onto Constance would be better for pedestrians and for people driving in and out. But there wasn't anything there that needed any planning commission concern.
Any other committee reports? A couple of you have announcements, I believe. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, today is First Thursday, so I think those that are available should get out and about and enjoy the festivities around town. I know the AIA is hosting a lecture series tonight and slideshow presentation at the Channing Peak Gallery at 6 o'clock, and I'm sure there's other events in the neighborhood as well.
When, Mr. Chair, if I may add on, I'd like to add, I think it might be of interest to the Planning Commission, the Historic Landmarks Commission had on its agenda 2112 Santa Barbara Street, which is the building that was where the Fielding Institute was. And they had to sell the place because it was, public use, and it just didn't meet seismic safety standards, and it was just way too expensive to retrofit it. So they sold it to a young couple who are interested in restoring it to the way that it was. And, of course, the commission is interested in having it possibly become a landmark, certainly a city landmark. But that was, you don't often have that happen where a commercial use reverts back to single family, but this is one place where it is.
Campanella.
I have not seen it yet, but my understanding is there's a new concept over in Paseo Nuevo called the Work Zone. Mayor Schneider was cutting the ribbon on that. It's sort of like a collaborate workspace for people, young professionals, where they can gather together and collaborate, is my understanding. So there was a ribbon cutting at 3 o'clock, and I believe they're open for tour and discussion this evening as part of First Thursday, and it would be in the same entrance that Social Security is. And it's called the Work Zone. So I was interested in seeing that. I don't, if anybody else is interested, I think they're open till 8 o'clock.
No excuse, right across the street, right? Yeah. Okay, so we'll be adjourned until next Thursday.